Chapter 511. Mana. 2. Eliana's breath hitched. A strange sensation prickled along her skin. Subtle at first, like the ghost of a touch, but then it deepened, sinking beneath the surface. An itch. Not the kind that could be ignored. This was something else, something buried within her core. A pulse, a shift, a pull. Her brows furrowed as she pressed a hand against her chest, fingers curling slightly against the fabric of her gown. It was faint but unmistakable. Mana. Her mana. Her heart pounded as realization struck. It had been nearly a decade since she had last felt this. Since the first time she had awakened, still just a child, still brimming with the potential of something new and unknown. But back then, she had only barely begun training, still learning the foundation of control, still trying to grasp the shape of the power within her. Then came the illness. Her body had failed her, had swallowed her strength whole, leaving her nothing but weakness and exhaustion. The mana that had once stirred within her had faded into silence, lost, unreachable. Until now. What is this? Eliana's fingers twitched as the sensation grew, the itch turning into something deeper, hotter, like a storm pressing against the inside of her ribs, begging to be released. And then, a flicker of light came from her hands. Her breath caught as she stared, her amber eyes widening. A faint, shimmering glow danced along her fingertips, like embers catching in the air. For the first time in years, her mana was responding. The realization sent a sharp jolt of both excitement and fear through her. This wasn't supposed to be possible. She had accepted it, had lived with it. The girl who once dreamed of wielding mana had been forced to become something else entirely. So why now? Why was it surging? The moment stretched, barely more than a handful of seconds, but it was enough for others to notice. A shift in the air. A ripple of energy, unfamiliar yet unmistakable. The knights turned. Their training halted in an instant, their focus snapping toward her with sharp, trained instincts. And then, "My lady, careful!" A powerful voice rang out, cutting through the courtyard like a blade. Eliana barely had time to react before she heard the thunderous steps closing in. Captain Lucavion Thorne, the leader of the expedition, the very man who had once been charged with her safety, until he failed. She knew why he was here, why her father had placed him in charge of training rather than letting him take the missions he once led. It was a punishment, though an unfair one. Lucavion had never been responsible for what happened to her. It had been Madalena who had ensured her downfall, who had driven her to ruin. But the Duke needed someone to bear the weight of it. And so, Lucavion had been sent back, stationed here, watching over the knights rather than standing on the front lines where he belonged. Now he was charging toward her. "My lady, step back." His voice was sharp, commanding. She saw it the moment his instincts took over, mana surging around him as he prepared to stabilize whatever anomaly was happening. And in that instant, something snapped. The moment his mana flared, her body reacted violently. Eliana barely had time to gasp before the pressure inside her burst outward. A storm of energy surged from within her, raw and unchecked, colliding with Lucavion's presence like a clash of opposing forces. The air around her cracked with power, shimmering with an unstable brilliance. Eliana's breath came in short, uneven bursts. But strangely, she felt no pain, no harm, only the lingering hum of power in the air, the faint crackle of mana still dissipating around her. Cautiously, she opened her eyes, and there, a thin veil of energy surrounded her, shimmering like a translucent shield. Not her mana, someone else's. Her gaze flickered downward, taking in the faint glow that pulsed along the air around her. A color familiar, controlled, steady. The same color as Lucavion's mana. Eliana's head snapped up. Lucavion stood before her, his stance firm, his hands still raised, fingers curled slightly as if guiding the very energy that encased her. His dark brows were furrowed in concentration, his breath heavier than before, but his expression was composed. He had protected her. He had reacted instantly, shielding her before the mana surge could spiral into something worse. Eliana swallowed, trying to steady herself. What just happened? Idren exhaled, lowering his hand as the protective barrier around her dissolved into nothingness. He studied her carefully before speaking, his voice measured yet firm. You experienced a mana backlash, he explained. Your core reacted to an external mana source, mine and the Knight's, and because you've never properly controlled your own energy, it surged out of you without restraint. Ileana's fingers twitched at her sides. A mana backlash. It was a known phenomenon, but it typically only happened to those who advanced too quickly, to those whose mana exceeded their control. She had never advanced. She had never even used mana since her childhood. So why now? Then why did it happen? She asked, her voice quieter. But there was an edge to it. An uncertainty she wasn't used to feeling. Idren's sharp blue eyes locked onto hers. There was a flicker of hesitation there, as if even he wasn't entirely certain of the answer. But when he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of someone who had seen enough to recognize something unnatural. I am not entirely certain, he admitted, his voice measured. But it appears that your body has been accumulating mana for years, without any proper outlet for it. He exhaled, studying her carefully. Since you never trained it, never circulated it properly, it remained dormant. And now it's reacting on its own. Ileana's fingers curled slightly against the fabric of her gown. Accumulated mana. Dormant, waiting, and now suddenly surging because she had never learned how to control it properly. Her father had once told her that her mana had faded entirely, that it had vanished after her illness, leaving her without the ability to wield it. But if what Idren was saying was true, then that had never been the case. It had always been there, sleeping, waiting. Idren straightened, crossing his arms over his chest. I should report this to the Duke. Ileana's head snapped up. No. Idren's brows furrowed slightly at her immediate response. That isn't necessary, she continued, voice firm. This was just an accident. Idren's expression darkened slightly. My lady, this isn't something that should be ignored. If your mana is reacting like this, it's only a matter of time before it happens again. The Duke should be informed. Ileana's lips pressed into a thin line. Her father would take this as another excuse to control her, another reason to watch her even more closely, and she refused to give him that. I can handle it on my own, she said, her voice carrying an edge of defiance. Idren held her gaze, searching her expression, before he sighed, running a hand through his hair. This is for your safety, my lady. I understand that you may not want the Duke involved, but this isn't something you can simply ignore. Ileana remained silent. Seeing her reluctance, Idren shifted his approach. This kind of phenomenon can happen naturally, he stated. And the solution is something you wouldn't hate. Ileana narrowed her eyes. Which is? You just need to train mana accumulation, he explained. Nothing complex. Just simple exercises to circulate your energy so that it doesn't build up uncontrollably. If you do that, this shouldn't happen again. Ileana exhaled slowly, absorbing his words. He made it sound simple, manageable, and yet, something inside her resisted. She had abandoned that path a long time ago. Seeing her hesitance, Idren added, for the time being, you should also be careful about where you are. Stay away from places where awakened individuals are actively using mana. Ileana frowned. So, in other words, she had to be cautious around half the people in this damn mansion. Idren didn't give her a chance to argue. With a curt nod, he stepped back. That is all for now. Take care, my lady. And just like that, he turned and strode away, leaving Ileana standing there, her thoughts tangled. The quiet hum of the courtyard settled once more. The knights, though discreet, had clearly taken notice of the event, but none dared to approach her. Ileana inhaled sharply and turned on her heel. Her feet carried her forward, her mind too tangled to focus on where she was going. She walked past the gardens, past the towering pillars of the estate, past the familiar corridors that had once enclosed her. And then, she found herself standing before the entrance of the mansion, and there she saw someone she didn't expect. Chapter 512. You are taking me with you. Ileana stopped in her tracks. There, Seated casually on one of the luxurious couches in the entrance hall was Lucavion. The sight of him alone was enough to stir irritation within her, but it wasn't just him that caught her attention. It was the small creature perched on his shoulder. A cat, a sleek, white-furred feline with sharp, intelligent eyes, its tail flicking idly as it balanced effortlessly beside him. That cat! Her gaze lingered. She hadn't seen it in the duchy before, but she had seen it with him, back on the expedition's ship, right? She had completely forgotten about it until now. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she observed him further. He was no longer wearing the formal attire he had been forced into during his time in the mansion. Instead, he had returned to his usual clothes, the kind he seemed far more comfortable in. Dark, durable fabrics fitted for travel, for movement, an adventurer's attire. His estoc hung at his waist once more, the weapon swaying slightly as he leaned back against the couch with effortless ease. Is he going out? Eliana's curiosity sparked before she could stop it. He had mentioned he would be leaving soon, but this soon? Now? Had he been planning to just slip away without a word? For some reason, the thought bothered her. Eliana straightened, schooling her expression as she took another step forward, her voice cutting through the quiet of the entrance hall. Eliana didn't speak immediately. Instead, she allowed her presence to settle first. A deliberate step forward, the faint sound of her heels tapping against the marble floors. A measured glance, taking in every detail before offering acknowledgement. Lucavion noticed her, of course. He always did. His gaze flickered toward her without urgency, his expression unreadable save for the faintest hint of amusement lurking beneath his usual confidence. He didn't move, didn't straighten or adjust his posture. But there was something in the way he regarded her that made it clear he had been aware of her the moment she stepped into the hall. The cat on his shoulder twitched an ear, its sharp eyes flicking toward her as well before returning to its lazy, regal posture. Eliana took another step closer before finally speaking, her tone light, but intentional. "Lucavion," she greeted smoothly, her expression composed. "I didn't expect to see you here." A statement, not a question. She had no intention of asking outright what he was doing. Not yet. If there was one thing she knew about Lucavion, it was that he was prone to dodging direct inquiries with irritating ease. Lucavion's lips curled into the ghost of a smirk. "And yet, here I am." Eliana arched a delicate brow, unfazed. "So it would seem." A pause. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze flicking toward his attire before meeting his eyes again. "You look ready," she remarked, the words casual, almost idle. Quite the departure from the formal wear. Lucavion exhaled in amusement, adjusting his sleeve with an air of practiced ease. "It was something the maids forced on me," he said, tilting his head slightly. "I couldn't just refuse a lady wishing to change my clothes, could I?" Eliana's expression immediately hardened, her amber eyes narrowing into a glare. "So you would let any woman touch you, then?" Lucavion blinked once, then let out a soft chuckle, clearly entertained by her reaction. "You're making it sound like I was doing something inappropriate," he countered smoothly. "Surely, the maids of your mansion know their etiquette." "They do?" Eliana shot back, her tone dry. "But I'm not sure you do." Lucavion placed a hand over his chest, feigning an expression of wounded innocence. "Now that is unfair," he said. "You make me sound like some scoundrel who lays hands on every woman without consent." Eliana's glare sharpened. "I wonder why." He grinned, entirely unrepentant. "What?" he asked lightly. "I did get permission from you." Her expression darkened. "You lied to me and drugged me." Lucavion paused, his smirk faltering for the briefest of moments. Then, with an overly deliberate cough, he glanced away. "Ahem. I did not lie." Lucavion's lips parted slightly, as if he intended to say something in his defense, but no words came. Eliana's smirk widened. "So you accept that you drugged me?" Lucavion remained silent. For once, he had no immediate retort. She took a step closer, her amusement barely concealed as she watched him, waiting. The slight narrowing of his eyes, the subtle shift of his posture. He hated conceding anything, even when caught red-handed. Her smirk curled further. Good. But she had no intention of letting him escape the conversation so easily. Now, she continued smoothly, folding her arms. What exactly are you waiting for here? Lucavion's expression relaxed back into nonchalance, though his silence a moment earlier had not gone unnoticed. He leaned further into the couch, tilting his head slightly as he regarded her. Are you curious? He asked, voice laced with knowing amusement. Eliana met his gaze without hesitation. I am. Lucavion hummed thoughtfully, drumming his fingers against the armrest. Why? Eliana clicked her tongue, her patience thinning. Bastard, she muttered. After all those things, are you really asking why? She huffed, shifting her weight slightly as irritation flickered across her expression. Wherever you go, trouble follows. Lucavion's smirk deepened, but he made a show of tilting his head, as if considering her words. Eliana's eye twitched. Infuriating. Eliana's breath hitched. Something was off. It wasn't just Lucavion's usual infuriating nonchalance, nor was it the lazy amusement that he always carried in his voice. It was the air itself. Something was about to happen. She could feel it, just as she had felt the mana surge earlier, just as she had felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her since stepping into the entrance hall. Lucavion must have noticed the way her posture shifted, the way her eyes sharpened, because the teasing lilt in his voice faded. And then, his gaze locked onto hers, the smirk on his lips curving into something unreadable. Are you afraid that I'm going to leave completely? Eliana flinched. Her entire body tensed before she could stop herself, the reaction immediate, instinctual. Her fingers curled slightly at her sides. Her breath caught somewhere between denial and something far more dangerous. Lucavion saw it. Of course he did. His eyes gleamed with sharp amusement, but beneath it, something else lurked. Something heavier. Eliana willed herself to recover, to smooth out the flicker of emotion that had slipped through the cracks. But it was too late. Lucavion had already seen too much. She inhaled sharply, lifting her chin. Don't flatter yourself. Lucavion's smirk remained, but he tilted his head slightly, as if studying her. Oh? So you wouldn't mind if I walked out those doors right now? Eliana's jaw tightened. He was baiting her, as always, but this time it worked. She did mind, and that realization infuriated her. You! She took a step forward, the space between them narrowing. You have a habit of leaving chaos in your wake, Lucavion. He smiled. So I've been told. Eliana glared. You think it's amusing? Only a little. Her eye twitched. Lucavion leaned back slightly, tilting his head toward the entrance. Then I suppose I should get going. You did say trouble follows wherever I go. He moved to stand. Eliana's hand shot out before she could think. Fingers curled tightly around his wrist. Lucavion blinked. Then, slowly, he glanced down at where her hand gripped his arm before his gaze flickered back up to meet hers. Eliana, her grip tightened. You're not leaving without me. Lucavion stared at her for a moment, something unreadable flashing behind his eyes. Then, slowly, infuriatingly, his lips curled into a grin. Ah, he murmured. So you are afraid. Eliana's glare burned. Shut up, she snapped. You're taking me with you. Lucavion exhaled a soft chuckle, shaking his head. Forcing yourself into my plans, are you? Yes. His amusement deepened. My, how bold. Eliana's eyes darkened. Do you want me to make it an order? Lucavion sighed dramatically, though the glint in his gaze told her he had no real objections. Well, he said, I suppose I can't refuse a lady when she asks so nicely. Eliana scoffed, but her grip didn't loosen, and Lucavion didn't pull away. Chapter 513, Bloody Annoying. Lucavion tilted his head, studying her with that insufferable mix of amusement and knowing. Then, in a voice laced with deliberate exasperation, he muttered, Reckless. Eliana's brows furrowed. What? He sighed, shaking his head as if she had just proven a point. Just like a certain someone, he continued, his smirk deepening. Always acting before listening to the full story. Eliana immediately knew who he was referring to. Her father, right? She could still recall the moment clear as day. The Duke's mana curled around Lucavion's face, his voice laced with anger, with warning. And now Lucavion had the audacity to compare her to him? Eliana's glare sharpened. "Oh, please," she shot back. "If I ever want to learn something from you, I have to jump through hoops and drag the truth out of you." Her voice dipped with irritation. "It's bloody annoying." Lucavion exhaled a soft chuckle, completely unbothered by her frustration. "That sounds like a you problem, Eliana." She scoffed. "It's a you problem. Disagree." Eliana clenched her teeth, her grip still locked around his wrist. Why was talking to him like trying to catch smoke with her bare hands? She had half a mind to actually make this an order. But something in Lucavion's eyes told her he was enjoying this far too much, and she refused to let him have that satisfaction. Instead, she inhaled sharply, tightening her hold. "You're still taking me with you," she stated, unwavering. Lucavion let out a quiet hum, tilting his head slightly. "All right," he said, his tone carrying an easy acceptance. "But do you even know where I'm heading?" Eliana's glare remained fixed on him. "What if I really am leaving?" he continued, watching her carefully. "Would you leave everything behind just like that?" He paused, letting the weight of his words settle between them before adding, "Wouldn't the Duke just kill us both?" His smirk was still there, but his eyes gleamed with something sharper. Assessing, testing. But Eliana wasn't so easily shaken. She had spent enough time around Lucavion to know when he was toying with her. And this teasing, this mock concern, only proved that he wasn't truly leaving. Not yet, because for all his unpredictability, for all his reckless charm and infuriating antics, there was one thing about Lucavion that remained consistent. When it mattered, he was always serious, even if he hid it behind that damnable smirk. Eliana's amber eyes gleamed as realization settled in. Her grip loosened just slightly, and then she smirked. Lucavion's expression faltered, his eyes widening. Just a fraction, just enough for her to see. And that was all she needed. "What, you bastard?" she taunted. "Did you think you were the only one who could talk as if you knew everything?" Her smirk curled further. "I already figured you out." Lucavion cleared his throat, leaning back slightly. "Ahem, I was just surprised. Also, who said you figured me out?" Eliana's eyes sparkled with amusement. "Your eyes did." For just a split second, so brief that most wouldn't have caught it, Lucavion tensed. It was there in the slight shift of his shoulders, in the way his smirk faltered before quickly recovering. And Eliana saw it. Oh, she thought, he's flustered. She was right. Lucavion exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck before letting out a small, resigned sigh. "You win this time." He met her gaze, a flicker of something unreadable in his expression before he added, "Little Ember." Eliana's smirk widened. "Heh!" The satisfaction was instant, but Lucavion wasn't done. His smirk returned, slower this time, almost contemplative. "Still," he mused, "it's quite reckless, isn't it?" Eliana arched a brow. Lucavion tilted his head slightly, watching her with that knowing gaze. "Even if I'm not leaving completely, what if I were going somewhere dangerous?" He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough to make the words feel heavier. "Would you follow any man like this?" Eliana scoffed, rolling her eyes. "I am not you." Lucavion chuckled. Fair." But Eliana wasn't done. She crossed her arms, her expression turning smug. "And listen to you talk, acting like you couldn't refuse when a woman offered to dress you." Lucavion hummed, pretending to think for a moment before he gave her a lazy grin. "Ah, but that would mean you see me as someone special." Eliana didn't even hesitate. She nodded. Lucavion blinked. Eliana smirked. "Of course you are." Lucavion recovered quickly, his grin deepening. "Oh? Finally admitting it, are we?" "Yes." she said smoothly. He raised a brow, clearly waiting for her to continue. And she did. You are the biggest troublemaker I have ever seen, she said, exasperation laced into every syllable. And someone needs to oversee you, or else who knows what would happen under my duchy's rule. Lucavion let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. Ah, so I require supervision? Yes, Aliana deadpanned. Lucavion sighed dramatically, pressing a hand to his chest. How tragic. And here I thought it was because you couldn't get enough of my handsome face. Aliana's glare sharpened, but for the briefest moment, her thoughts betrayed her. When she had first met him, she had thought Lucavion's face was average. Not unpleasant, but certainly not remarkable. She had attended countless banquets in her youth, surrounded by nobles whose beauty was polished to perfection. Lucavion hadn't come close to them. At least, that's what she remembered thinking. But now, she found herself lingering on the way his dark eyes caught the light, how they seemed almost impossibly deep, like the kind of abyss that could pull her in if she wasn't careful. No way. She refused to let that thought take root. Instead, she scoffed, tilting her head with practiced disdain. Narcissistic bastard, she muttered. Who said you were handsome? Lucavion sked, shaking his head. Stingy. But he didn't press the matter further. Instead, he sighed and settled back onto the couch once more, stretching slightly before casting her a sidelong glance. If you're so determined to supervise me, why not send someone stronger? He gestured vaguely toward her with a lazy wave of his hand. Do you really think you could stop me if anything happened? Aliana didn't hesitate. She smirked. Then, without warning, she took a deliberate step forward, closing the distance between them. Lucavion's brow arched slightly in intrigue, but he didn't move. Not when she stopped just before him. Not when she leaned in, close enough for him to see the fire in her amber eyes. And then, she raised her right hand, extending her index finger until it pressed lightly against his nose. You better try me, she murmured. The challenge was clear. Her eyes glinted, daring him. Because truthfully, she wanted him to make a move, because then she would have a reason to lock him down here, to keep him from slipping away again. Lucavion stiffened for a split second. Not from fear, but from the sheer, sudden realization that this woman was dangerously unpredictable in a way he hadn't quite accounted for. A shiver ran down his spine before he could stop it. He exhaled slowly, eyes flickering over her expression before settling back onto her gaze. I better not, he muttered. Smart choice. Chapter 514, Pointing Finger. Just as Aliana's finger remained poised against Lucavion's nose, a low, sharp gore cut through the air. Her body reacted before her mind caught up, instincts kicking in as she swiftly retracted her hand. Just in time. A small white paw swiped at the space where her finger had just been. Aliana blinked, her gaze snapping toward the culprit. Lucavion's damn cat. Perched on his shoulder, the feline now had its ears flattened, its sharp, intelligent eyes locked directly onto her. Its tail flicked once, slow, deliberate. There was nothing playful about its reaction. It hadn't been a harmless bat of the paw. That had been a warning. Aliana narrowed her eyes, fully turning her attention to the creature. The cat did not back down. It met her gaze with an unsettling stillness, its pupils narrowing slightly as if analyzing her, assessing her. And for some reason, Aliana felt something off, something she couldn't explain. Her mana, still faintly humming beneath her skin from earlier, reacted, not in a volatile way, but as if it had suddenly noticed the presence of something else, something wrong. Her expression didn't change, but inwardly, she bristled. This cat wasn't just a cat, and whatever it was watching her. Aliana didn't like that. Not one bit. The fact that this damn cat had dared to swipe at her, to warn her as if she were the intruder here. Unacceptable. Her eyes narrowed further, sharp and unyielding. But before she could retaliate, Lucavion let out a low chuckle and reached up, running a slow, casual hand along the feline's back. Easy, he murmured, his tone amused yet soothing. She's like that, often hostile. The cat's tail flicked again, but it didn't swipe a second time. It merely continued staring at Eliana with those eerie, knowing eyes. Eliana scoffed, crossing her arms. I didn't take you for someone who couldn't control a mere cat. Lucavion's smirk didn't falter. I don't control people, he said smoothly. If that's what you thought of me, I must say, I'm quite hurt. Eliana's expression remained deadpan. She refused to dignify that with a response. Instead, she let her gaze flicker back to the cat, still perched on Lucavion's shoulder like some self-important guardian. I don't like this woman. Lucavion barely suppressed a smirk as Vitalyara's voice rang in his mind, sharp and displeased. Oh, he mused internally, tilting his head slightly as he ran a lazy hand along Vitalyara's back. This is what finally sets you off. Not the countless women I've teased before. Shut up. Lucavion chuckled to himself. He already knew why. The moment Eliana had stepped forward, closer than anyone else had dared, Vitalyara had reacted instantly. She had never been one to tolerate threats, and in her eyes, Eliana had crossed the invisible boundary of what was acceptable. So, Lucavion continued, his internal voice light with amusement. Is this the Eliana that you talked about? Yep. This woman? This irritating woman? Vitalyara scoffed. She's Eliana? Lucavion nodded slightly, his fingers still trailing lazily over Vitalyara's fur. She is. A long, heavy pause. Then, she was that veiled woman? Yes, she was. Immediately, a low, sharp growling rumbled through their connection, and Lucavion had to bite back another chuckle. Vitalyara's tail lashed behind him, her fur bristling. Lucavion hummed, taking another long, slow glance at Eliana, who was still glaring at Vitalyara as if she were trying to decide whether or not to throw hands with a cat. I don't like her. Vitalyara huffed, her golden eyes flicking toward Eliana with clear disdain. She looks worse than that night woman. Lucavion raised an eyebrow, suppressing another smirk. You mean Valeria? Humph. Lucavion chuckled under his breath. And what exactly makes Eliana worse? Vitalyara flicked her tail sharply, a clear sign of irritation. She's just annoying. Oh, yes, the way she stands there, acting all self-important, pushing her way into things that don't concern her. Lucavion tilted his head slightly. That's an interesting way to phrase it. Vitalyara was always prickly when it came to women approaching him, but she would never openly admit it. Instead, she dressed up her objections in something else. Lucavion hummed, his fingers idly stroking along her fur. You sound particularly invested. Shut up. Lucavion's smirk deepened. Before he could tease her further, footsteps approached from the hall. Sir Lucavion, Anne's voice rang out as she stepped closer. The carriage is ready. Lucavion turned his attention toward her, but before he could respond, Anne's gaze suddenly flickered to the side, and the moment she caught sight of Eliana, she stiffened. A brief pause. Then her brown eyes widened slightly. Am my lady? She immediately bowed her head in respect. Lucavion raised an eyebrow. Interesting. Eliana's expression remained composed, but a flicker of curiosity passed through her gaze. It was clear she didn't recognize Anne, which made sense. Eliana had been isolated while she was recovering from her illness, and those tending to her would have been experienced senior maids, ones familiar with handling her condition. And, on the other hand, Lucavion glanced at the younger maid, who still seemed slightly nervous. She must have been assigned elsewhere. Lucavion smirked, watching the unspoken exchange between them. Well now, this just got even more interesting. Eliana's gaze flickered toward the young maid, observing her carefully. She was young, far younger than the senior maids who had attended to her during her illness. Her face was unfamiliar, but there was something about her eyes, something vaguely reminiscent of a person Eliana should remember. A relative, perhaps? The daughter of one of the older maids who had once served her? It was possible, but at the moment, The girl looked more nervous than anything. Eliana exhaled softly, accepting the greeting with a slight nod. "You may rise," and immediately straightened, though the nervousness didn't fade entirely. Eliana tilted her head slightly, watching her. The girl was clearly uncertain, and while Eliana had no patience for incompetence, she also knew that every servant had to learn eventually, and hesitation wouldn't serve her here. Eliana took a step forward, her tone measured but firm. "Your name?" and stiffened slightly but quickly answered. "Anne, my lady." Eliana hummed thoughtfully. "And how long have you been in service here?" and swallowed before replying. "Almost 2 years, my lady." Eliana arched a brow. 2 years. Yet she had never seen her before. That meant she had to have been assigned elsewhere. Most likely away from the main wing. Or perhaps away from her. Eliana studied her for another moment before speaking again. Eliana's gaze flickered briefly toward Lucavion before returning to Anne. The girl was nervous, that much was clear. But what caught Eliana's attention wasn't just her nervousness. It was the way she kept sneaking glances at him. Subtle, careful, but noticeable. Eliana's amber eyes narrowed slightly. So she was the one assigned to serve him. Her lips curled into something almost unreadable before she turned fully to Anne. Her voice smooth but pointed. "This guy, did he bother you?" And blinked, caught completely off guard. "Eh?" Lucavion immediately let out a soft chuckle, his smirk deepening. "Eliana, you wound me," he drawled lazily. "Why would you assume I was the problem?" Eliana didn't even spare him a glance. Her sharp eyes remained locked onto Anne, who was now looking between the two of them, clearly struggling to process how she had suddenly become the center of this conversation, and opened her mouth, hesitated, then quickly shook her head. "And no, my lady." Sir Lucavion did not. He was very polite. Lucavion sighed dramatically, placing a hand over his chest. "See? Polite. I would never dream of causing trouble." Eliana finally turned her gaze toward him, her expression flat. "Really?" Lucavion grinned. "Really?" Eliana stared at him for a moment longer before exhaling through her nose, unimpressed. Humph. She didn't believe him for a second. Chapter 5:15, Driver. Eliana let out a small, amused breath before turning back to Anne. "Thank you for your good work," she said smoothly. "It must have been hard for you," and blinked rapidly, as if unsure whether she was being praised or pitied. She quickly straightened, clearing her throat before bowing. Thank you, my lady. I am honored to serve." Eliana hummed, her gaze assessing. The girl was young, inexperienced clearly, but she wasn't incompetent, just nervous. But then Eliana asked, "The carriage is outside, correct?" and hesitated for a moment before glancing toward the entrance. Lucavion hummed lazily beside her. "It should be," he drawled, "unless something truly unfortunate has happened in the past few minutes," and nodded. "Yes, but—" She paused, looking at Eliana as if debating whether to speak further. Then, after a brief moment of hesitation, "My lady, are you going with Sir Lucavion too?" Silence. Eliana slowly turned her full attention to Anne. Lucavion let out a quiet chuckle under his breath, clearly entertained, but wisely said nothing. Eliana wasn't mad, not truly, but she was aware of one thing. Since when does a maid dare to question the lady of the household? Her amber eyes glinted, not unkindly, but sharply enough to make her point, and stiffened, immediately realizing her mistake. "Ah, I didn't mean." Eliana raised a single brow. It wasn't that she intended to reprimand the girl. She could tolerate such slip-ups. Lucavion would brush them off. But other nobles? They wouldn't. And was lucky that it was her standing here and not some self-important aristocrat who would take offense over the smallest slight. And, well, the girl did look kinda cute, all flustered and anxious like that. It would be such a waste if she got reprimanded for something like this. So, instead of scolding, Eliana simply sighed and let her gaze soften, just slightly. "A maid should be mindful of her words," she said, her tone cool but instructive. and swallowed hard and quickly bowed. I apologize, my lady. Eliana nodded once, accepting it. Then, without another word, she turned to Lucavion. I am going, she stated flatly, making sure and had no reason to doubt anymore. Lucavion chuckled. My, how decisive. Eliana shot Lucavion a glare, already irritated by the amusement in his voice. I am leaving with you, she repeated firmly. And before we go, I should inform the butler. Without waiting for his response, she turned on her heel and strode toward the hallway. Lucavion naturally followed, but not before casting one last glance at Anne. The poor girl was still standing there, stiff and unsure, eyes flicking nervously between them. Lucavion smirked. Then, with exaggerated slowness, he winked at her and gave a subtle thumbs up. His lips moved silently, forming the words, "Not bad." Anne's face turned an alarming shade of red. Eliana must have sensed something because, without turning back, she snapped, "What are you talking about behind my back?" Lucavion's smirk deepened. Are you getting paranoid now, dear little Ember?" Eliana huffed, folding her arms as she kept walking. "Humph. It's hard not to be when it comes to someone like you." Lucavion laughed. Rich, careless, completely unbothered. "Ahahaha, now that sounds like a you problem." As they stepped out of the grand estate, the crisp evening air greeted them. The carriage was already waiting, the horses shifting slightly in place, their breath visible in the cooling air. The coachman, a middle-aged man with a rugged face and sharp eyes, straightened as soon as he spotted Lucavion. But then, his gaze slid past Lucavion and landed on Eliana, and he blinked, once, twice. Then, very unsubtle, he turned to Lucavion with a look that practically screamed, "Who is this woman, and why is she here?" Lucavion, of course, noticed immediately. He smirked. Eliana, on the other hand, pretended not to see the driver's reaction, though she could already tell what was coming. The man, still clearly perplexed, finally cleared his throat and said, "Sir, where should I head towards?" Lucavion stretched lazily before stepping forward, placing one foot onto the carriage's step. "Stormhaven Center," he said smoothly. The driver nodded, though he was still very obviously sneaking glances at Eliana, as if trying to determine who she was. He hesitated for a moment before finally blurting, "Understood, sir. But, will the lady be coming with us?" Eliana arched a delicate brow, exhaling through her nose. "Yes, clearly." The driver tensed at her sharp tone, quickly straightening as if he'd just realized his mistake. "Ah, of course, my lady," he stammered. Lucavion, of course, didn't help matters. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, propping an elbow against the edge of the carriage with a smirk. "You seem surprised," he mused, eyes glinting with amusement. The driver hesitated, clearly unsure of how to respond. "Well," the driver shifted awkwardly, clearing his throat again. "Well, it's just that I wasn't informed a lady would be accompanying us, sir." His eyes flicked toward Eliana, uncertainty flickering across his face. "The carriage may not be suitable." Eliana remained unbothered, simply adjusting the cuff of her sleeve. Lucavion, however, was far more entertained. He leaned slightly against the carriage door, his smirk deepening as he watched the driver struggle. "Oh," he mused, feigning concern. "And why is that? Did you forget to polish the seats today?" The driver stiffened. "And no, sir, of course not. It's just that, well, had I known we'd be transporting someone of—" He hesitated, stealing another glance at Eliana, still trying to place her identity. "Ahem, a noblewoman standing. I would have ensured that the proper arrangements were made." Lucavion hummed, amusement still evident in his gaze. Eliana finally spoke, her tone cool but even. "There is nothing unsuitable about this carriage." Her amber eyes flickered toward the driver, assessing. "Or are you suggesting I should turn back?" The driver paled slightly, shaking his head quickly. "Not at all, my lady. It's just—" He trailed off, as if realizing there was no way to finish that sentence without digging himself into a deeper hole. Lucavion chuckled under his breath. He could see the wheels turning in the man's head. The uniform, the mannerisms, the carriage itself, it all belonged to the Thaddeus Duchy. And yet, this man had failed to recognize the heir of the very household he served. Fascinating. His gaze flicked toward Eliana, expecting something. Displeasure, irritation, maybe even amusement. Instead, he found nothing. She was completely indifferent. Interesting. If she had noticed the absurdity of the situation, she didn't react to it. Lucavion let the moment stretch, watching her in quiet curiosity. But since she didn't seem to care, he saw no need to point it out either. "Well," he drawled, rolling his shoulders lazily. "She's coming with me." Simple, direct, and final. The driver hesitated only for a second longer before nodding quickly. "Understood, sir." With that settled, Lucavion stepped forward, holding the carriage door open with an exaggerated flourish. "After you." Eliana didn't hesitate. She stepped inside, settling onto the seat with effortless composure. Lucavion followed, sliding in across from her, one leg crossed over the other. As soon as he got comfortable, Vitaliera hopped down from his shoulder and curled up beside him, flicking her tail with mild irritation. With the door shut, the carriage jolted forward, rolling steadily down the cobbled streets. The sun hung low in the sky now, painting the city in warm hues of amber and gold. Long shadows stretched across the roads as the day slowly gave way to evening. Chapter 516, Meeting Corvina. Eliana sat in silence for a few moments, watching the cityscape shift outside the window. The streets of Stormhaven were beginning to transition from the bustle of day to the quieter hum of the evening, the golden light casting long shadows against the cobblestone roads. Then, without turning to face him, she finally spoke. "What exactly are you planning to do in the city center?" Lucavion, who had been idly stroking Vitaliara's fur, glanced up with a small smirk. "Oh, curious, are we?" Eliana's amber eyes flicked toward him, unimpressed. "You dragged me into this trip. I have every right to know where we're going." "Wow. How shameless to say that I was the one dragged you when you basically barged in." "Well, I learned from someone quite talented." "So?" Eliana gave him a flat look before repeating, "What are you planning to do?" Lucavion exhaled through his nose, resting an elbow against the window frame. "Meeting someone. Business matters." Eliana's eyes narrowed slightly. "Who?" Lucavion's smirk didn't waver. "You'll see." Silence stretched between them. Eliana's fingers curled slightly against the fabric of her dress. She hated vague answers. Her glare sharpened, but Lucavion remained entirely unbothered, turning his attention toward the passing scenery instead. His gaze followed the swaying branches of the trees lining the road, the evening light filtering through the leaves in shifting patches of gold. Then, quietly, almost absent-mindedly, he murmured to himself, "It's been a while since I've taken a carriage." It was barely above a whisper, a thought spoken more to himself than anyone else. But Eliana caught it. She turned her head slightly, studying him. Lucavion's usual amusement had dimmed just slightly, his expression unreadable as he gazed out the window. It wasn't nostalgia in his voice. It was something more difficult to place. Something distant. Something lost. Eliana didn't comment on it. Instead, she simply watched, waiting to see if he would say anything more. But he didn't. The moment passed, and Lucavion's smirk soon returned, his attention flicking lazily back to her as if nothing had happened. "Well," he mused, "should I take that silence as a sign that you're actually being patient for once?" Eliana's glare sharpened, her lips pressing into a thin line. "You're the one who can't stand silence." Lucavion raised a brow, his smirk still in place. "Even in that cave," she continued, her voice edged with pointed accusation, "you were the one who spoke the most." Before Lucavion could respond, a flicker of movement caught his attention. Vitaliera, still lying curled up beside him, turned her head, golden eyes flicking toward him. Lucavion sighed, as if the weight of the world had been placed upon his shoulders. He stretched slightly, then gave a small shrug. Well, he mused. Someone needed to lift the spirits of a certain sick lady. Eliana scoffed. Spirits. Yes, spirits. Morale. Mood. Whatever you want to call it. Lucavion tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. And it worked, did it not? Eliana's fingers twitched slightly in her lap. It worked, she admitted. Then her voice quieter, colder. Until you decided to take it away. Lucavion's smirk faltered. Just slightly. The golden light outside the carriage had deepened, the sun sinking lower, bathing the streets in a subdued glow. The gentle sway of the carriage seemed to stretch the silence between them. Lucavion let out a slow breath, running a hand through his hair before leaning back against the seat. Yeah, he murmured, voice softer now. I'm sorry for that. Eliana blinked. Then she exhaled slowly, her fingers pressing lightly against the fabric of her dress. She should still be mad. She wanted to be mad. But the truth was she wasn't. Not anymore. Not after everything. Not when she knew the truth. And, to be frank, seeing him like this, leaning back against the seat, his usual arrogance tempered by something quieter, something more real, it made her want to. Eliana tensed. No, absolutely not. But the thought had already formed. Some ridiculous, absurd part of her wanted to pounce on him, to grab his head, pull him against her, wrap her arms around him, and, what are you thinking? Eliana's spine stiffened, her hands curling into tight fists against her lap. Her mind reeled, scrambling for some sort of rationality, something to drag her back from that dangerous train of thought. And then, a memory surfaced, a certain moment, so vividly clear, like a drop of ink spreading through water. Lucavion, sleeping, his head resting on her lap, his breath slow, steady, his usual smirk absent, leaving behind nothing but quiet, unguarded exhaustion. Like a child who had finally stopped fighting sleep. Like someone who had let himself rest, if only for a moment. Eliana's breath caught. She couldn't remember this. She shouldn't remember this. Because if she did, if she let herself remember, she wasn't sure she'd be able to hold back. Her hands tightened further, her nails pressing into her palms as she forced herself to look away, to shove the memory aside before it could sink any deeper. No, not now. Not ever. Lucavion, unaware of the war raging inside her mind, let out a quiet hum, still gazing out the window. His smirk had returned, lighter this time, absent of its usual teasing edge. Something on your mind, little Ember? Eliana turned her head toward him, schooling her expression into one of perfect indifference. Humph. She crossed her arms. Nothing of importance. Lucavion chuckled, his eyes gleaming with amusement. If you say so. Eliana exhaled slowly, steadying herself. The memory was gone, for now, but the feeling it left behind still lingered. The guild hall was in absolute chaos. The moment Corvina stepped out of the private transaction chamber and back into the main hall, she was met with a wall of noise, raised voices, desperate bargaining, and the heavy scent of blood and sweat lingering in the air. It had been like this since the moment the expedition had failed, since the moment that monster had appeared. She still could remember that day, when the first wave of adventurers returned from the expedition. Adventurers crowded every available space, some leaning against the walls, others hunched over tables, drinking away the remnants of their terror. Healers rushed between them, tending to fresh wounds, their magic casting brief glows across exhausted faces. The scribes at the registry desk were overwhelmed, scribbling down reports while guild officials shouted over one another, trying to bring order to the chaos. And in the middle of it all, adventurers bickered and accused, their fear twisting into anger. Corvina's fingers pressed against her temple for a brief moment before she straightened, her sharp gaze sweeping the room. Stormhaven hasn't seen this level of unrest in years, and all because of that thing. She knew what it was. The higher-ups knew what it was. But no one else could. Kraken. A monster of legend. One that should have remained deep beneath the ocean. far from the shores of Stormhaven. And yet it had emerged. Why? She had no answer for that yet. The expedition had been meant to push back the sea beasts that had grown too bold near the eastern trade routes. A routine operation carried out every few years. The plan had been solid, the teams well prepared. But none, had expected the abyss to birth such a nightmare. And now dozens of adventurers were dead. The rest? They were shaken, their faith in the guild, and their own strength, teetering on the edge. Corvina knew the weight of this moment. One wrong move, one poorly handled decision, and the guild's reputation could crumble. A breath, a sharp, measured inhale. And then she moved. Guild Master, one of her aides, a younger scribe, rushed toward her, a pile of reports clutched in his trembling hands. We've got the final list of missing and confirmed dead from the expedition. The official numbers. He hesitated, looking pale. She snatched the papers from him and skimmed the contents quickly. 32 confirmed dead. 17 still missing. 12 critically injured. Her grip tightened around the parchment. Too many. She folded the report with precision and tucked it under her arm. Make sure the families of the fallen are contacted immediately, she instructed. And the missing, continue searching. We don't stop until we know. Yes, Guildmaster. Chapter 517. Meeting Corvina. 2. The weight of leadership was a heavy thing, and tonight, Corvina could feel it pressing against her shoulders more than ever. Sitting behind her desk in the guild's administrative chambers, she leaned back slightly, rubbing her temple as she studied the financial breakdown before her. The duchy's compensation had arrived, an undeniably hefty sum as expected, but gold alone wasn't enough to soothe the tempers of those who had lost comrades. A calculated move, as always. The dukedom had been quick to send the funds, ensuring that, at least on paper, their obligations were met. They wanted to control the damage before it spiraled further. But no amount of gold could erase the bitter taste of failure that lingered in the hearts of the adventurers. And, of course, they wouldn't bring their demands to the Duke himself. No, that task fell squarely on her. The guild was the formal representative of the adventurers, the one organization with the authority to speak on their behalf. And so, the anger that should have been directed toward the duchy had instead found a home here, inside the walls of her guild. Corvina exhaled slowly, her fingers tapping against the edge of her desk. Annoying, but predictable. She had already drafted responses to the duchy, reinforcing the need for additional compensations, not just for the families of the fallen, but for future expedition incentives, hazard pay, and resource recovery. The gold they had sent was substantial, yes, but it would not be enough to fix this. The Duke needed to understand that. And if he didn't, well, she would make him understand. Just as she was considering the next move in this increasingly delicate political dance, a familiar sound drifted through the hallways. Raised voices. Not unusual in times like these, but something about the tone made Corvina pause. She didn't rise, not yet. Instead, she tilted her head, listening. Through the heavy oak doors of her office, she could hear the murmurs of the guild's reception area. The anger wasn't directed at her, at least not directly. Instead, her receptionists were bearing the brunt of it. A storm was brewing, and she had no intention of stepping into it just yet. Instead, she remained seated, allowing herself a brief moment to listen. "This is unacceptable," a voice barked, rough with frustration. "We risked everything, and what do we get? Some measly compensation?" Another spat. This was the duchy's operation. They should be the ones standing here, answering for what happened. And yet, where are they? Safe behind their damn walls while we're the ones burying our own. Corvina's lips pressed into a thin line. Of course, this was inevitable. The expedition had failed, and people wanted someone to blame. She knew better than anyone that actual accountability in matters like this was a rare thing. The duchy would never admit fault, not openly. That was why they had sent her gold instead of an apology. Gold was easy. Responsibility, that was a different matter entirely. Her receptionists, however, had no such luxury. "Please, sir," one of the clerks said, her voice trying to remain level despite the pressure. I understand your frustrations, but the guild should be doing more, the man interrupted. You're the ones who speak for us, aren't you? Or are we just expendable to you, same as we are to the damn nobility? Another voice, slightly calmer but no less bitter, cut in. You knew, didn't you? A heavy pause followed. Corvina's eyes sharpened. Knew what, exactly? One of the receptionists hesitated. An instant of silence, but it was enough. You did. The first adventurer's voice lowered into something almost dangerous. You knew something was wrong. You knew this wasn't just a normal expedition. Corvina exhaled slowly, the weight of the conversation pressing against her like an invisible force. She tapped a single finger against the desk in thought. This wasn't true. No one had known about the Kraken. Not the guild. Not the duchy. Not even the adventurers who had ventured into those cursed waters. The expedition had been routine, predictable. Until suddenly it wasn't. Until the impossible happened, and a nightmare from the depths tore everything apart. But the truth hardly mattered now, did it? People weren't looking for facts. They were looking for someone to blame. She couldn't control what rumors they whispered in the dark corners of the guild. Nor could she undo the paranoia that had begun to spread like rot through Stormhaven. What she could do, however, was keep this from spiraling out of control. Let them rage. Let them shout. It changes nothing. Her mind drifted to another matter. One that had been gnawing at the back of her mind for days. The Duke's daughter. Why had she even been there? It was an absurd decision, reckless, unfathomable. Corvina had pored over the reports, searching for some justification, but there was nothing that made sense. Why would someone send their sick daughter to such a place? I really can't comprehend, she murmured to herself, resting her chin against her knuckles. The official explanation from the duchy had been vague at best. Something about recreational travel and overseeing minor matters related to trade. A laughable excuse. Corvina knew how noble families functioned, and no one sent a fragile heir into a volatile region without reason. Unless, of course, they wanted her gone. She didn't like that thought. It was too conspiratorial, too grim. But the moment it had entered her mind, she couldn't shake it. And yet, as incomprehensible as the situation was, the outcome was even stranger. She had received the news just a few hours ago, privately, through secure channels. The Duke's daughter had been rescued, alive. That fact alone should have brought relief, but instead, it only unsettled her further, because no one else had come back. None of the adventurers who had been swallowed by those vortexes had resurfaced. No bodies had been recovered. No messages, no survivors, no traces. It was as if the ocean itself had erased them. The fact that the Duke's daughter had survived and returned meant something crucial. Something that sent a shiver down Corvina's spine. It meant the opportunity to escape had existed. The others, the adventurers who had been caught in those abyssal vortexes, hadn't been outright erased. They had a chance to make it back. And yet none of them had. Why? Had they fought to the last moment, struggling against the pull of the sea, only to fail? Had they been separated, scattered across whatever lay beyond those swirling maws? Had one of them come close to escaping only to fall just short? Or, Corvina clenched her fingers into a fist. Was there something else at play? Was there a reason only the Duke's daughter had made it back? A coincidence? Or a choice? The thought disturbed her. Even if this is just an assumption, the implications are unsettling. She let out a slow breath, trying to untangle the knots in her mind. But instead of clarity, her thoughts led her somewhere else. To someone else. A certain young man. Lucavion. Or, as most in Stormhaven knew him, Luca. Her fingers paused against the surface of the desk, and for the first time in days, uncertainty slipped through her carefully crafted mask of composure. What happened to you? She murmured, almost to herself. She had not forgotten him. After all, how could she? Lucavion had carved his name into the adventurer's psyche with terrifying ease. The stories of his strength, his composure, his sharp tongue, and sharper blade had spread like wildfire in the short time he had been in the city. He was no ordinary adventurer. That much had been obvious from the start. And yet, he, too, had been swallowed by the vortex. She tapped her finger against the desk again, an uncharacteristic display of unease slipping through her usual control. It doesn't make sense. By all accounts, Lucavion had been one of the most capable fighters in the expedition. He had even fought the Kraken itself. There had been rumors, adventurers whispering in hushed voices about how he had stood his ground when the behemoth had risen from the depths, how he had cut into it. A D-rank adventurer had done something not even the strongest among them had dared attempt. And now, gone, vanished. No body, no message, nothing. Just like the others. And yet, the guild had been getting pressure. The duchy had sent repeated, pointed inquiries about a certain adventurer. About Luca. Corvina exhaled slowly, her grip tightening. She had deflected them as long as she could. Given vague answers. Stalled. But the pressure was mounting. And she couldn't hide the truth forever. Because the truth was this. Luca did not exist. Not truly. Not in the way the duchy thought he did. Lucavion was real. But Luca? Luca was a name of convenience. A forged identity, woven together with just enough subtlety to pass through the guild's records without raising suspicion. Until now. They must have known something was amiss from the beginning, Corvina thought. But they're only pressing now because he's missing. Why? Who was he to them? Had someone recognized him? Had his actions drawn too much attention? Corvina sighed and leaned back in her chair, staring up at the ceiling for a moment. You really are a troublesome one, Luca? The question lingered in the air, an itch in the back of her mind that refused to fade. Where are you? Corvina had barely settled into the thought, the question forming in the depths of her mind. Where are you? When the air in the guild hall shifted. A subtle ripple in the noise. A moment of tension that only someone as attuned to the atmosphere as she was would notice. Then, a voice. I am here to meet with Guild Master Corvina. Chapter 518, Two Ladies. I am here to meet with Guild Master Corvina. Her breath caught. That voice. A voice she knew. A voice she had not expected to hear again. Corvina sat up straighter, her hands still against the desk as she turned her attention toward the door. Her mind worked faster than her body, scanning through the possibilities before she could fully accept what her instincts already told her. The receptionist, a young woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue, shot the man standing before her an irritated glare. If I let everyone who wanted to meet the guild master waltz right in, this entire guild would turn into a marketplace, she snapped, clearly unimpressed. State your business properly or get in line like everyone else. Her voice carried through the hall, drawing the attention of several adventurers. And, as if waiting for an excuse to release their simmering frustration, they turned toward the newcomer with a mix of amusement and disdain. Who does this guy think he is? One of them scoffed, arms crossed. Another fool wanting special treatment? Another sneered. Laughter rippled through the crowd, low and mocking. Maybe he thinks he's some important noble, someone joked. The air in the guild hall was thick with exhaustion, irritation, and unspoken resentment over the failed expedition. This man, this stranger who spoke as if he had any right to demand an audience with Corvina, was the perfect target to take their frustrations out on. But then, my name is Lucavion. The words cut through the noise. A casual statement. No hint of arrogance. No attempt to justify himself. Just a name. A declaration. But to Corvina, to her, it was enough. Instant recognition struck like lightning. Lucavion. Not Luca. Lucavion. If he had given the name Luca, she might have hesitated. Might have dismissed it as another desperate fool trying to claim the name for himself. It had happened before, after all. But none of those impostors had known his real name. Because no one in Stormhaven did. None of the adventurers surrounding him, mocking him, laughing at him, realized what they had just heard. But she did. Corvina's breath stilled for only a moment before her fingers moved instinctively, pressing against the smooth surface of the artifact embedded in her desk. The response was immediate. A soft hum of magic. A faint flicker of golden light. At the reception desk, the lamp sitting beside the young woman flared to life. A signal. The receptionist, mid-sentence in her scolding, snapped her mouth shut as the glow bathed the desk in its command. Her eyes darted toward the private office, realization dawning instantly. A slow breath, a begrudging acknowledgement. She turned back to the man before her, her earlier irritation replaced with something more neutral. "You may proceed." A hush settled over the surrounding adventurers, confusion flashing across their faces. "What? That's it. Who is this guy?" But the receptionist said nothing more, simply stepping aside. Lucavion, his expression unreadable, gave the smallest tilt of his head before moving forward. And in the distance, behind her desk, Corvina exhaled slowly. She leaned back slightly, her fingers still resting against the artifact, the glow now fading. Her mind raced. "He's alive." Corvina exhaled slowly, her fingers pressing against the desk as she processed what had just happened. He was alive. Lucavion was alive. Her grip on the artifact tightened slightly before she forced herself to release it. She had invested too much into this man for him to simply die. If he had perished, if all that effort, all those calculations, all those risks had been for nothing, then everything would have gone wrong. And she hated when things went wrong. A quiet breath, a mental shift. By the time the door opened, she had already composed herself, her expression schooled into its usual cool indifference. Lucavion stepped inside, his usual air of lazy confidence preceding him. He took his time, his sharp eyes scanning the room in an almost casual manner, before finally letting his gaze settle on her. Then, his lips curled into that infuriating smirk. "You are alive, Lucavion," Corvina said, her voice even. Lucavion tilted his head slightly, his smirk deepening. "Miss me?" Corvina exhaled sharply, rolling her eyes as she leaned back in her chair. "I should have known you'd be insufferable the moment you walked through that door." Lucavion placed a hand over his chest in mock offense. "And here I thought you'd be happy to see me." Before Corvina could respond, "Heek! Hey! Why are you pinching me?" Corvina's head snapped toward the voice, her sharp eyes landing on the source of the commotion. And then she paused, because standing beside Lucavion, arms crossed, expression irritated, was a woman. Not just any woman. A woman with striking amber eyes and an air of authority that was impossible to ignore. And, judging by the way she was now glaring daggers at Lucavion, one who was clearly not used to being dragged around like this. Corvina blinked once, then twice. Her gaze flickered between the two of them, her mind rapidly adjusting to this unexpected development. Slowly, her expression shifted into something that could almost be described as amused. Corvina's gaze lingered on the woman for a moment longer, a flicker of curiosity breaking through her usual composed demeanor. She had never seen this woman before, and she would have remembered if she had. The sharp amber eyes, the way she carried herself, poised but with a tension that spoke of someone who wasn't used to being led into rooms without having the upper hand. And then there was the undeniable presence about her. One that didn't demand attention, but commanded it effortlessly. Yes, this was not an ordinary woman. Corvina leaned forward slightly, fingers steepling in front of her as her sharp gaze flicked toward Lucavion. "And who exactly is this?" she asked smoothly. Lucavion, standing far too relaxed for someone in the presence of an obviously powerful individual, let out a small sigh. Then, without missing a beat, he turned toward the woman and offered her the most insufferable smirk. "Well, go on," he said with an exaggerated wave of his hand. "Introduce yourself. We're all so curious." The woman didn't look at Corvina. No. Instead, she glared at Lucavion. A withering look, filled with the kind of barely restrained annoyance that Corvina found herself appreciating. Lucavion, entirely unaffected, simply tilted his head and added, "Or do you need me to do it for you?" The woman scoffed, arms crossing over her chest. "Don't push your luck." Lucavion gave her an innocent look. "Me? Never." The response was immediate. She pinched his arm hard. "Heek! Hey!" Lucavion flinched, rubbing at the spot with a mock-offended expression. "Why are you so violent?" The woman gave him a pointed look. Why do you deserve anything else? Corvina watched the exchange in silence, her amusement only growing. Because this was interesting. Very interesting. It wasn't the bickering, no, that was normal for Lucavion. He had a way of drawing out reactions from people, of poking and prodding until even the most composed individuals lost their patience. What intrigued her was the way he was acting. Lucavion did not defer to anyone. Not nobles. Not mercenaries. Not even her. And yet, here he was bantering but not pushing. Teasing but not provoking. That meant something. That meant that this woman, whoever she was someone he respected enough not to step too far. And that made her someone Corvina had to take seriously. Filing that observation away, she finally let her lips quirk into a faint smile. "You're no fun," Lucavion muttered, still rubbing his arm as he glanced back at Corvina. "You must be used to that by now," the woman retorted. Corvina chuckled under her breath before returning to her original question. "Lucavion," she said smoothly, "I'd like to know who our guest is." Lucavion let out a long-suffering sigh, as if this were the most inconvenient thing that had ever happened to him. "Fine, fine," he said, shaking his head before turning toward the woman with a half-smirk. "Would you like me to embellish or keep it simple?" The woman exhaled, clearly done with his nonsense. "Just say it." Lucavion looked back at Corvina and, with the same easy confidence he always carried, said, "Guildmaster, allow me to introduce you to." He paused, eyes glinting with something unreadable. Then, after a brief second, he gave a small, almost amused shrug. "Aeliana." Chapter 519. Aeliana Thaddeus? The moment the name left Lucavion's lips, Corvina stilled. Aeliana. Where had she heard that name before? Why did it feel like something important, like a half-forgotten truth resting just beyond her grasp? Her gaze flickered toward the woman, Aeliana, who met her stare without hesitation, her amber eyes sharp and unwavering. And it was in that moment, as their eyes locked, that recognition struck like lightning. Corvina inhaled sharply. That name is not common. Not here. Not anywhere. And more importantly, there was only one Aeliana who could make someone like Lucavion hold back. Someone who had been sick. Someone who had been reserved. Someone who had barely ever been seen beyond the walls of nobility. Aeliana Thaddeus, the daughter of the Duke, the girl who had been rescued, and now she was standing here right in front of her. Corvina's fingers twitched against the desk as her mind raced. But does that make sense? The heir of House Thaddeus, Stormhaven's fragile, sickly noble daughter, had supposedly been in the vicinity of the failed expedition, had been lost and then recovered. Aeliana Thaddeus, the one who was too weak to leave her estate, the one who wasn't supposed to survive beyond her guarded walls, the one the entire city whispered about. And yet, here she stood. Not frail, not pale, not weak. She stood before Corvina, arms crossed, expression alive with irritation, very much not the image of a sickly noble heir. Am I mistaken? No, she knows she isn't mistaken. Lucavion's presence had already been enough to shake the foundation of the guild. But this was something else entirely. Corvina's mind reeled, piecing together the implications. If she was rescued, then how? Why her? None of the other missing adventurers had returned. None. So how did she survive? Her gaze drifted between Lucavion and Aeliana, the tension in the air subtly shifting as she processed what this meant. Lucavion knew. She could see it in the way he stood, in the way he watched her reaction. This is deliberate. His silence wasn't indifference. It was intentional. Corvina's lips parted slightly, but she stopped herself from speaking too soon. She needed to be careful. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, her sharp gaze settling on Aeliana once more. And then, in a carefully neutral voice, she asked. Corvina cleared her throat softly, testing the waters with a measured tone. "By Aeliana, do you mean Lady Aeliana Thaddeus?" Her words carried both deference and a carefully guarded curiosity. Even as guildmaster, she knew better than to show overt disrespect to the lady of the household upon whose lands so many relied. The formal address hung in the air, a delicate balance between protocol and genuine inquiry. Lucavion's lips curled into that familiar, roguish smirk. "I knew you were sharp," he teased, his voice a smooth blend of amusement and approval. Corvina's gaze flickered between the two figures. The way Lucavion's smirk played upon his face confirmed her suspicions, yet left her with more questions than answers. How could this be? If it was truly Lady Aeliana Thaddeus, the very same girl once deemed fragile and unfit to venture beyond her gilded estate, how did she now stand here, defiant and very much alive? Wasn't she supposed to be sick, weak and withdrawn? Corvina wondered silently, her mind reeling with implications. The image of the delicate, ailing noble girl she had heard whispers about clashed violently with the commanding presence of the woman before her. The tension in the room deepened, as if every eye could sense that this revelation carried weight far beyond mere titles. Corvina, ever the consummate professional, forced herself to maintain neutrality, though her thoughts swirled with disbelief and intrigue. Corvina barely had time to fully process her thoughts before Aeliana spoke. "You must be thinking about how I am here, even though I was supposed to be sick." The words were smooth, direct, devoid of hesitation. Corvina's lips parted slightly before pressing back together, her fingers curling just slightly against the desk. Sharp. This woman was sharp. After a brief pause, she gave a single nod. "I would be lying if I said it hadn't crossed my mind." Aeliana's expression shifted. Not mocking, not defensive. A smile. "It is because I am cured now." Simple, clean, an answer that left no room for doubt. And yet, Corvina felt the weight behind it. The revelation settled over the room like an invisible force, the pieces clicking into place in Corvina's mind. Cured. The word carried more meaning than it should. Aeliana Thaddeus, the sickly noble daughter, the fragile heir to one of the most powerful houses in Stormhaven, had been cured. Corvina exhaled slowly through her nose. That explained everything. The change in posture, the energy in her gaze, the way she stood with undeniable authority. This was no longer the noble girl hidden behind estate walls. This was someone who had tasted freedom. Aeliana continued, her tone even. "I understand that you have not gotten the news, as it was only just confirmed yesterday." Corvina narrowed her eyes slightly, absorbing the information. That made sense. House Thaddeus was powerful, and any news regarding its heir's recovery would have been tightly controlled. Corvina sighed, exhaling slowly as the realization settled in. Everything made sense now. The sudden recovery, the confidence, the authority. Yet one question still remained. Why was she here? Aeliana Thaddeus, heir to one of the most powerful houses in Stormhaven, a woman who had been confined to her estate for years, had walked into her guild with Lucavion at her side, completely at ease. That was what Corvina didn't understand. She leaned forward slightly, her sharp gaze unwavering. "I see. Your recovery explains many things, Lady Aeliana," she said smoothly. "But that still doesn't answer one question." A pause. "What brought you here?" Aeliana didn't respond immediately. Instead, she glanced to her side, toward Lucavion. He blinked. "Ha!" Then, with all the elegance of a woman who knew she was about to cause trouble, Aeliana said, "I am here to supervise him." A beat of silence. Lucavion's expression froze. "Heh!" Corvina's brows lifted slightly, the sheer unexpectedness of that answer catching her off guard. Supervise? Lady Aeliana Thaddeus, the daughter of the Duke, had come all the way here to supervise Lucavion? Aeliana, ignoring Lucavion's baffled reaction, continued smoothly, "This man is a troublemaker." Lucavion let out a small noise of protest, but Aeliana carried on, unbothered. "He has a habit of causing chaos wherever he goes, and someone needs to ensure that it does not escalate further." Corvina's lips parted slightly before pressing back together. She had expected a great many reasons for Lady Aeliana's presence here. Political maneuvering, House Thaddeus asserting its influence over the guild, perhaps even something related to the duchy's ongoing concerns over Lucavion's identity. But this was unexpected, Corvina's gaze drifted to Lucavion. He was looking at Eliana with a mixture of exasperation and disbelief. His arms crossed over his chest. Then, in a completely helpless tone, he turned to Corvina. "As you can see," he said, gesturing toward Eliana with a suffering sigh, "I am currently being detained. Please help." Corvina blinked, then blinked again. For a moment, just a brief moment, she was genuinely left speechless. Lucavion, detained, by Eliana Thaddeus. She had thought she'd seen everything in her years as guildmaster. Apparently, she had been wrong. Chapter 520. What happened there? The air settled into something more composed, if only on the surface. Corvina, ever the professional, quickly remembered her role as the host despite the utterly bizarre turn this meeting had taken. She shifted back into her chair, exhaling quietly as her attendant approached the table with a well-balanced tray, carefully pouring tea into each delicate porcelain cup. The rhythmic sound of liquid meeting ceramic was a welcome moment of calm amidst the lingering tension. Lucavion, ever the opportunist, leaned forward, watching with mild interest. "Ah, at least someone here treats me well," he mused as the warm cup was placed before him. Eliana shot him a look. "You should be grateful anyone tolerates you at all." Lucavion smirked but said nothing, choosing instead to lift his cup with a knowing glint in his eye. Corvina's lips twitched, but she said nothing, accepting her own tea with a graceful nod to her attendant before finally turning her attention back to the real matters at hand. She was still wrapping her mind around Lady Eliana's presence here, still processing the utterly baffling reality of the noblewoman's self-imposed supervision of Lucavion, but there were far more pressing concerns that needed to be addressed first. The expedition. She set her cup down lightly, her fingers tracing the rim as she regarded the two across from her. Then, with practiced ease, she steered the conversation toward the matter she could not afford to leave unspoken. "The failed expedition," she began smoothly, her voice calm yet carrying weight. "I assume you have something to say about it." Eliana, who had just been reaching for her cup, stilled. Her amber eyes flicked up to meet Corvina's, the poised expression on her face unreadable. Lucavion let out a quiet hum, swirling the tea in his cup lazily. "That's a rather broad topic, Guildmaster." Corvina's sharp gaze landed on him, unamused. "Then let's narrow it down." A beat of silence. Then, "You were there, weren't you?" Corvina's voice was steady, but the question carried a deliberate weight. "You fought the Kraken." Corvina knew she had to tread carefully. As much as she wanted answers, she could not simply demand them from Eliana. Not outright. For all that she was guildmaster, her rank did not surpass that of the Duke's daughter. And while Corvina had little patience for the formalities of noble hierarchy, she was not reckless enough to overstep where it truly mattered. However, Lucavion had brought Eliana here. That alone spoke volumes. Lucavion was calculating, a man who did not move without reason. If he had brought Lady Eliana Thaddeus into her guild, it meant he trusted her enough to hear the truth. So she would ask. She placed her cup down lightly, her fingers resting against the porcelain for a moment before she spoke. "You fought the Kraken?" she repeated, her voice steady as her gaze locked onto Lucavion. Lucavion smirked, setting his cup down. "Yes, and you both survived." Eliana gave a quiet, almost imperceptible sigh. Clearly, Corvina ignored the bite in her tone. "Then I must ask you both. What happened?" Lucavion stretched slightly, as though considering where to begin. "It's simple, really. The expedition was going as planned until it appeared." Corvina's fingers tightened slightly against the table. "The Kraken," she murmured. Lucavion gave a small nod. It surfaced without warning. No shift in the tides, no rumblings from the deep. Just there, tearing through ships and stations before anyone could react. Corvina exhaled through her nose. A complete disaster. Even worse than the reports had suggested. She shifted her gaze toward Eliana, watching her reaction. The noblewoman's face remained unreadable, her hands resting against the table, fingers lightly curled around her teacup. "And the others?" Corvina pressed. Lucavion tilted his head. Which others? The adventurers. Lucavion went quiet for a brief moment. Not out of hesitation, but deliberation. Corvina leaned forward slightly. They were swallowed by the vortexes. I need to know what happened to them. Ileana's expression darkened slightly. Lucavion exhaled, his smirk fading just slightly. I won't sugarcoat it, Corvina. His voice lost its usual teasing lilt. It was chaos. Once the Kraken emerged, the entire formation collapsed. The vortexes weren't just pulling people under. They were tearing them away. Corvina's stomach tightened. She had suspected as much. Still, she had to ask. What of their condition? Do you know if they... Lucavion leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Then, without hesitation, without even the slightest shift in his tone, he said, They're all dead. His voice was calm, steady, as if he had not just spoken a death sentence upon the missing adventurers. Corvina's fingers twitched slightly against the porcelain of her teacup. The way he said it, so certain, sent a quiet chill through her. She inhaled slowly, controlling her expression. How are you so sure? Lucavion exhaled through his nose, tapping a single finger against the rim of his cup. Because I saw it. A beat of silence. Then he elaborated. The vortexes didn't just swallow them, he murmured. They took us somewhere else. Somewhere far worse. Corvina narrowed her eyes slightly, absorbing his words. Where? Lucavion tilted his head slightly, gaze flickering with something unreadable. If I had to describe it, a land untouched by mercy. The moment we arrived, the air was different. The world was different. And the creatures. He exhaled, shaking his head slightly. Vastly beyond what you've seen. Corvina frowned. Beyond. Ileana, who had remained mostly quiet up until this point, finally spoke. He's not exaggerating. Corvina turned her attention to her, taking in the solemnity in her expression. The creatures there were unlike anything from our lands, Ileana continued. Bigger, stronger, relentless. If you hesitated, you died. If you were weak, you died. And if you weren't smart enough to move quickly, her fingers tapped lightly against the table. You died. Lucavion gave a small chuckle at her bluntness, but there was no humor behind it. Corvina felt a deep unease settle in her chest. She had known the vortexes were unnatural, that something had happened beyond them, but to hear it confirmed, to hear that the adventurers had been thrown into a land of death itself, was something else entirely. Her grip on her cup tightened. You said you saw most of them die. Lucavion's smirk faded slightly. I did. A simple answer, but a heavy one. Corvina's mind raced. She had read the reports. The duchy had searched for traces of the missing. The fact that Ileana had been rescued had been the only glimmer of hope that others might return. But Lucavion's words, when we were brought back, he continued, meeting her gaze, no one else returned with us. The finality in his voice made her chest feel heavier. That's my reasoning, Guildmaster, Lucavion finished. I don't know anything else. Corvina's frown deepened, her fingers pressing lightly against the table. Something didn't add up. If that's the case, she said slowly, her voice carrying an edge of skepticism, then why are you here? Lucavion blinked at her, then smirked. Isn't it obvious? Corvina's sharp gaze didn't waver. Enlighten me. He leaned back in his chair, stretching slightly before resting an elbow on the armrest. I'm here for business, of course. A pause. Corvina narrowed her eyes. Business. Lucavion nodded, completely unbothered by the weight of the conversation that had preceded this moment. What else would I be here for? Corvina exhaled slowly, barely restraining the urge to rub her temples. You just told me you were thrown into a land of death, that nearly everyone perished, that you barely made it back, and now you're here. For business? Lucavion's smirk didn't fade. If anything, it deepened. Well, what else am I supposed to do? He shrugged, entirely too casual for someone who had just walked out of what should have been his grave. I came back with quite a haul. It would be a waste to let it rot. Wouldn't it? Corvina stared at him, trying to decide whether she was more exasperated or concerned. Eliana, however, just let out a quiet sigh, reaching for her tea. "You see what I've been dealing with?" Corvina dragged her attention away from Lucavion for just a moment, eyeing Eliana with mild disbelief. "And you willingly followed him back here?" Eliana lifted her cup to her lips, taking a slow sip before replying. "Someone has to make sure he doesn't do anything stupid." Lucavion gave her a wounded look. "I take offense to that." Corvina exhaled sharply through her nose, forcing herself to refocus. Fine. If he wanted to act like this was just another day, she would play along. For now, she sat back slightly in her chair, her voice returning to its usual crisp professionalism. "All right, if you're truly here for business, then let's get on with it." Lucavion's eyes gleamed with amusement. "I thought you'd never ask." He straightened slightly, his tone turning just a fraction more serious. "Take me to the same room as before. I've got quite a lot of monster carcasses to sell." Corvina raised a brow, but she wasn't truly surprised. Of course he had returned from a nightmare realm with goods to sell. She closed her eyes for the briefest moment before standing. "Fine," she said smoothly. "Let's see what kind of business you've brought back this time." Chapter 521. Why didn't you save them? The moment they stepped into the private transaction room, the atmosphere shifted. It was a familiar place, where high-value trades were conducted away from prying eyes, but this time the weight in the air was different. Corvina watched as Lucavion stepped forward, rolling his shoulders slightly before raising his hand. His fingers brushed over the surface of the spatial ring, a faint pulse of mana activating it. And then, the room was filled with monsters. A heavy thud echoed as a massive carcass hit the stone floor, followed by another, and another. The pile grew, strange and grotesque forms stacking one over the other. Corvina's breath hitched, her normally composed face betraying a flicker of surprise. Because what lay before her, these were not creatures of this world. Her sharp eyes swept over the bodies, taking in the details. Scaled behemoths with jagged, crystalline growths protruding from their backs. Insect-like horrors, their exoskeletons pulsing faintly, as if even in death, they still carried traces of unnatural energy. Wolves with too many eyes, their fangs elongated into something closer to spears. And then there were the larger ones, the ones that made her stomach twist just from looking at them. They were beasts unlike anything she had seen before, unlike anything that should exist in this land. "These are," she began, her voice betraying a rare moment of uncertainty. Lucavion tilted his head, smirking ever so slightly. "The monsters that I mentioned." She turned to look at him, her sharp gaze narrowing. There were a lot of them, too many, and if she had to guess, she was sure this wasn't all of it. Eliana stood nearby, silent, but watching closely. Corvina's hands clenched slightly at her sides, her thoughts churning, her mind grasping at the single, burning question that refused to be ignored. Why? Lucavion, sensing the shift in the air, met her gaze without hesitation. Corvina took a slow step forward, her expression unreadable, her voice barely above a whisper but heavy with emotion. "Why?" Lucavion blinked, tilting his head slightly. "Why what?" Her hands pressed against the table, knuckles white. "If you had the time and strength to deal with these monsters, if you were capable of hunting them down and returning with this haul." Her voice sharpened, cutting through the silence like a blade. "Why didn't you try to save them?" Eliana inhaled sharply at the accusation, but Corvina's eyes were locked onto Lucavion alone. She had let it sink in before. She had listened, analyzed, processed, but now she was angry, because the implication was clear. Lucavion had fought. Lucavion had survived. Lucavion had slain these creatures. Monsters that made even her, an experienced guildmaster, feel unsettled. And yet, he had declared the adventurers dead as if it was set in stone. As if there had never been a chance. Lucavion, for the first time since the conversation started, did not immediately answer. Instead, he simply looked at her. A tense silence filled the room, thick enough to be suffocating. Eliana's expression tightened, and she parted her lips, but before she could speak, Corvina pressed forward. "You don't know," Corvina said, her voice steady but carrying an edge. "You don't know what happened here while you were gone." Eliana's mouth shut. Corvina's gaze didn't waver as she continued, her voice unwavering, laced with something cold, something real. "Do you know how many adventurers came back maimed?" she asked. "How many lost their arms, their legs?" Lucavion said nothing. Corvina's hands curled into fists, pressing against the table. "How many children are crying right now because their fathers never returned? How many wives are grieving their husbands? How many guildmates left the expedition as a team, only to return alone?" Eliana exhaled softly, as if trying to say something. But before she could, Lucavion raised his hand. She stopped. Lucavion lowered his hand slowly, then turned his attention fully to Corvina. He met her gaze, unflinching. "Why didn't I try to save them?" His voice was calm, too calm. Then, a small, humorless chuckle left his lips. "That's right," he said softly, as if agreeing with her accusation. "I could have tried to save more lives." Corvina's breath caught. His voice wasn't defensive. It wasn't angry. It was something far worse. It was empty. Lucavion's dark eyes held hers, steady, unwavering. "Maybe I could have tried to look for more people. Maybe I could have pulled them under my wing. Maybe—" He let out a slow exhale. "Maybe it would have been harder, but I could have tried." Eliana shifted slightly beside him, her amber eyes darkening. Lucavion looked down at the monster carcasses spread out before them, his gaze distant. "I could have." A pause. "But I didn't." His voice was quiet, yet it sliced through the air like a blade. The silence in the room was suffocating. Lucavion remained still, his eyes fixed on the grotesque carcasses before him, as if seeing something far beyond the bodies lying there. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, his voice broke through the quiet, calm, steady, and sharp as a blade drawn in warning. "Miss Corvina, I am not a saint. If you have thought of me as such, then you are mistaken." Corvina inhaled slowly, feeling the weight behind his words. Lucavion finally looked up, locking eyes with her. There was no humor in his gaze now, no lingering amusement that so often accompanied his words. "Don't you already know my nickname? The title that people have given me." Corvina's lips parted slightly, her mind supplying the answer before she even realized she had spoken aloud. "Sword Demon." Lucavion gave a slow nod. "That's right." His voice didn't waver, nor did his expression change. "My name is Sword Demon, not Sword Saint." A pause. "And there is a reason for that." Corvina stared at him, something cold curling in her chest. She had heard the stories, the whispers. Corvina exhaled slowly, forcing herself to maintain her composure as she studied the man before her. "Your nickname," she murmured, fingers tapping lightly against the table. "Wasn't it because you played with your opponents in the tournament? Should I take it as something different?" Lucavion's expression remained unchanged. "You should." His voice was calm, far too calm. Corvina's sharp gaze did not falter. If anything, her focus only grew sharper. But before she could speak again, Lucavion leaned forward slightly, placing his elbow on the table, his gloved fingers lightly resting against his chin. "And you must also remember," he said, his tone taking on a deliberate weight, "I am here for business." His words hung in the air, and then his smirk faded, his eyes darkening. "For what right do you think you have to question my decisions?" Corvina's breath hitched. Lucavion tilted his head slightly, his next words cutting like a sharpened blade. "Did we make some sort of deal for that?" A pause. His voice, still measured, still impossibly composed, dropped into something lower, something colder. "Even if I could have saved them," he continued, his tone devoid of hesitation, "every single one of those adventurers knew the risks when they chose to join the expedition." The moment the words left his mouth, a shift occurred. A subtle, suffocating pressure filled the air. Corvina immediately recognized it. a leak of his aura. It wasn't intentional. It wasn't aggressive. But it was enough to warn her. Enough to remind her. Lucavion did not raise his voice. He did not slam his hand against the table. And yet, the sheer weight of his presence, the raw, unwavering certainty in his words, was enough to feel like a blade had been drawn between them. His eyes, dark and unreadable, locked onto hers. "You are being unprofessional, Guildmaster." Chapter 522, Aeliana the Haggler. Aeliana's gaze flickered toward Lucavion, watching him carefully. She had never seen him like this before. Oh, she had seen his arrogance, his playful mockery, his insufferable smirks, but this was different. His presence was suffocating. His words a blade so carefully sharpened that Corvina had no choice but to recognize the cut. And yet, Aeliana saw it. Even as he sat there, his expression unreadable, his voice calm, his posture relaxed. There was something off. Something in the way his fingers rested lightly against his chin, too measured. Something in the way his smirk had faded, replaced by something too precise, too controlled. Something in his eyes. Aeliana had spent enough time around Lucavion to know when he was playing a role, when he was shifting pieces on the board and deciding what mask to wear. Right now, he wasn't just intimidating Corvina. He was masking something. Aeliana didn't know what it was, but she could feel it. Still, this wasn't her place to intervene. She wasn't here to pick apart his mind. She had tagged along to see what he was doing. That was all. And so, she remained silent, her expression giving nothing away as she leaned slightly against the back of her chair, her amber eyes steady on Lucavion. Meanwhile, across from them, Corvina remained still. She wasn't a fool. She knew exactly what had just happened. Lucavion had drawn a line, a deliberate, unmistakable line, and she had nearly crossed it. Her fingers tapped against the table once, twice, before she finally exhaled softly. "I see," she murmured, her voice quieter now. She met Lucavion's gaze, searching for something, but whatever she was looking for, she wouldn't find it, because Lucavion had already decided. After a moment, she gave a slow nod. "I overstepped," she admitted. It wasn't an apology, but it was an acknowledgement. Lucavion studied her for a moment longer, then leaned back, his expression relaxing just slightly. "Good," he said, his smirk returning, albeit softer. "I was beginning to wonder if I had to spell it out for you." Corvina rolled her eyes, but the tension that had gripped the room just moments ago finally eased. Then she leaned back slightly, letting the tension in her shoulders dissipate, just enough to regain her sense of control. The shift in the atmosphere was subtle, but noticeable. The sharp, suffocating weight that had filled the air moments ago had lifted, replaced by something more neutral. "It appears I was getting tired as well." She hadn't realized it at first, but she could feel it now. The way fatigue crept at the edges of her thoughts, making her slip in ways she normally wouldn't. She was usually better at keeping her emotions measured, at maintaining a composed balance between her authority as guildmaster and the need to understand the people she dealt with. And yet, she had let her frustration seep through. "Perhaps it's because I've spent too much time dealing with grieving adventurers. Too much time reading reports filled with names that will never return. Too much time answering questions I don't have the answers to." She exhaled softly, lifting her teacup and taking a slow sip, letting the warmth soothe her. But none of that changes what just happened. Lucavion had drawn a line, and she had nearly crossed it. There was a difference between questioning a man's choices and questioning his principles. And Lucavion was a man with very clear principles, ones that did not waver under the weight of expectations, ones that were not bound by conventional ideas of morality. It wasn't that he didn't care. It was that caring did not change the decisions he made. And that is why he is dangerous. She had known this already, of course she had. He was called Sword Demon for a reason. But knowing something in theory was different from feeling the weight of it firsthand. Across from her, Lucavion had already shifted back into his usual demeanor, his expression lighter now, the sharpness in his eyes hidden once more behind a layer of amusement. Corvina let out a soft breath before finally speaking again. This time with the same measured calm she should have maintained from the beginning. "I won't press you further on it," she said. Lucavion's smirk twitched. "Oh, that's surprisingly reasonable of you." Corvina ignored the teasing remark, letting the moment pass without reaction. Instead, she placed her cup back onto the saucer, her fingers lightly tracing the rim as she considered her next words. "There's still the matter of these creatures you've brought back," she said, her gaze flickering toward the monstrous remains sprawled across the stone floor. "This is not something I can overlook." Lucavion's smirk remained, but there was something sharper beneath it, something knowing. "Of course," he said smoothly. "I wouldn't expect you to." Corvina exhaled, smoothing out the tension in her posture as she shifted back into business mode. Whatever had just transpired between them was over. For now. She was not someone who let emotions cloud judgment for long, and there was still a transaction to handle. Her sharp gaze flickered over the monstrous remains sprawled across the stone floor. Even now, they pulsed with an unnatural energy, a foreign presence that made the air feel heavier. "They are not from here. That much is clear." Slowly, she stepped forward, crouching slightly to examine one of the carcasses. A massive beast with jagged crystalline growths sprouting from its back, the faint glow still shimmering beneath its thick hide. "This," she murmured, fingers hovering near one of the cracked crystals before pulling back. "This is fascinating." Lucavion smirked. "I thought you might think so." Corvina ignored him, standing once more, eyes narrowing as she assessed the sheer variety of creatures before her. From their structure, their auras, even the decay of their cores, it's obvious that these monsters are of their own kind. They don't belong to any ecosystem I've seen before. Her gaze flicked toward Lucavion. "Which means they will be valuable." She could already think of several interested parties, the nobles, the high-ranking alchemists, the private collectors, but one, in particular, stood out. "The magic tower will be willing to pay well for them," she mused aloud. "They've been desperate for anything beyond the limitations of our realm. If I were to take these to them, they would throw their funding at the opportunity to study creatures from an unknown land." Lucavion's smirk deepened. "That is right." Corvina crossed her arms, tilting her head slightly. "If you want me to be the middleman for this, then we're going to split." She let the word linger, watching him carefully, testing the waters of negotiation. Lucavion exhaled lazily, as if already anticipating the direction she was going. "Of course, Guildmaster. We're both business-minded people, aren't we? How about an even 60-40? Corvina gave him a bland look. "No." Lucavion chuckled, shaking his head. "Then 50-50? Corvina clicked her tongue, looking entirely unimpressed. "Lucavion." He sighed dramatically. All right, 40-60. You take the 40. Corvina's lips quirked upward ever so slightly. "That's it. Just a little more." 30-70, she countered, her voice smooth, certain. "You take the 30. Lucavion's smirk twitched as he leaned slightly against the table. "Now, Guildmaster, do you really think I'm the type to walk away with 30%? I think you're the type who knows how to make repeat business work in your favor," she countered easily. "You get the reputation of being the one who supplies materials no one else can access, while I make sure you don't have to do the exhausting legwork of dealing with the magic tower's absurd demands." Lucavion hummed, feigning deep thought. Tempting. Corvina was about to press further, about to seal the deal, when... Stop! Chapter 523, Find Someone for Me. Eliana exhaled through her nose, barely resisting the urge to pinch the bridge of it. This was getting painful to watch. Lucavion, this cunning, sharp-tongued menace of a man, was getting ripped off. And worse, he didn't even seem to care. She had assumed, at first, that he was dragging the negotiation out just to toy with Corvina, that perhaps he was testing her, letting her think she had the upper hand before flipping the entire deal on its head. But no, he was just bad at this. Eliana felt something tighten in her chest. Was it secondhand frustration? Exasperation? Pity? She wasn't sure. All she knew was that she couldn't watch this disaster unfold for a second longer. Stop! The word left her lips before she could even think about it, cutting cleanly through the air. Both Lucavion and Corvina turned to her. Corvina raised an eyebrow, as if mildly intrigued by the interruption. Lucavion, on the other hand, well, the moment he saw her expression, that insufferable smirk of his deepened. Eliana crossed her arms, her voice laced with disbelief. What exactly do you think you're doing? Lucavion blinked, tilting his head ever so slightly. Business, of course. Business. Eliana repeated, her tone edged with incredulity. You call this business? Are you seriously about to let yourself be talked down to 30%? Lucavion let out a quiet chuckle. Oh, now you care about my financial situation. Eliana glared at him. It was one thing to be reckless in battle, to throw himself into danger without a care in the world. But this was just stupidity. I don't care, she said flatly. But I do have a problem with standing here and watching someone get swindled right in front of me. Lucavion placed a hand over his chest, feigning offense. Swindled? My dear Eliana, you're getting ripped off. Corvina, to her credit, merely observed the exchange with mild amusement. Lucavion sighed dramatically, leaning his chin against his palm. Ha! And here I thought you weren't getting involved. Eliana gritted her teeth, debating for just a second whether she should actually strangle him. But she wouldn't. No. Instead, she would fix this before Lucavion walked out of here looking like a fool. She turned to Corvina, her amber eyes sharp. This deal is ridiculous. He is the one who hunted these creatures. He is the one who retrieved them. And you're seriously going to sit here and act as if 30% is a fair split. Corvina exhaled through her nose, her lips twitching ever so slightly upward. You make a compelling argument. Eliana's amber eyes locked onto Corvina, sharp and unwavering. 90-10, she stated coldly. His favor. Lucavion blinked, then slowly, ever so slowly, turned to look at her, a new gleam of amusement flickering in his gaze. Corvina, on the other hand, stiffened slightly before narrowing her eyes, the briefest flash of irritation slipping through her composed mask. That, she said smoothly, though her voice carried an unmistakable edge, is crossing the line. Eliana didn't flinch. No, she countered. That is fair. Corvina let out a slow breath, her expression unreadable, but the sharpness in her gaze remained. You seem to misunderstand how negotiations work, Lady Eliana. I am the one facilitating this transaction. If you believe, the only thing you're doing, Eliana cut in, is connecting us to the magic tower. Silence. Corvina's fingers curled ever so slightly against the surface of the desk. Eliana pressed forward, her tone smooth, unwavering. Let's not pretend this is some great act of generosity, Guildmaster. You're not handling transport. You're not risking your men. You're not even making an investment. All you're doing is playing the middleman. Lucavion let out a quiet hum under his breath, his smirk deepening as he watched the exchange unfold. Eliana ignored him. You have nothing to lose, she continued, her voice crisp and measured. And yet you were planning to take 70% of the profits. For what, exactly? Corvina's jaw tightened slightly, but she did not speak. Eliana tilted her head, pressing just a little further. And if it's simply a matter of reaching out to the magic tower, then there's no need for your involvement at all, is there? Lucavion leaned forward slightly, intrigued now. Eliana lifted a hand in a slow, deliberate gesture. After all, she said, her voice smooth as silk, the duchy can handle that just fine. Another beat of silence. Lucavion's smirk turned sharp. Corvina's expression remained composed, but Eliana could see the shift, the silent recognition that she had been maneuvered into a corner. This wasn't a negotiation anymore. This was a power play. Eliana let the moment stretch before finally speaking again, delivering the final push. If you don't want the deal, she said simply, then we'll take our leave. She turned slightly, her gaze flickering toward Lucavion. I'll have the butler contact the mages directly. Lucavion let out a low chuckle, clearly thoroughly enjoying himself now. My, he mused, tilting his head toward Corvina. What do you say, Guildmaster? Corvina exhaled slowly, rolling her shoulders as she leaned back into her chair. A heavy pause filled the space between them, stretching just long enough to make the tension feel tangible. Then, a slow, measured smile spread across Corvina's lips. Corvina's smile remained slow and measured, her sharp eyes flickering between Aliana and Lucavion before she finally spoke. 85-15. Aliana narrowed her eyes slightly. She could push further, could likely get the 90-10 she had originally demanded, but this was still a significant improvement. More than enough. Before she could respond, Lucavion leaned back with an easy, satisfied smirk. That sounds fair. Aliana shot him a look. Now he thinks about what's fair? Corvina exhaled softly, rolling her shoulders before reaching for a quill. I'll have the documents prepared shortly. She tapped the feather lightly against the desk before adding, though, I get the feeling that's not the only thing you came for. Lucavion hummed, tilting his head slightly. You know me too well, Guildmaster. Corvina didn't respond, merely watching him with mild curiosity as she leaned back in her chair. What is it, then? Lucavion's smirk remained. But then, something shifted. He turned his head and looked directly at Aliana. Can you spare me a minute? His voice was smooth, calm, but his eyes, Aliana stiffened. Something about them was different. The usual teasing glint was gone. His gaze, dark and unreadable, held something else. Something she couldn't quite place. She didn't like it. Her instinct was to stay, to refuse. She wanted to remain in the room, to listen, to know exactly what he was about to ask. But this wasn't her place. She had already stepped into his business once. If she pushed further, it wouldn't be negotiation. It would be overstepping. And she wasn't that kind of person. Aliana inhaled slowly, holding his gaze for a moment longer before turning on her heel. Fine, she muttered. She didn't like it, but she walked out. The door shut behind her. And now, it was just Lucavion and Corvina. The room was silent after Aliana left, the tension still lingering in the air like an echo. Corvina watched Lucavion carefully, her sharp gaze not missing the way his posture shifted the moment the door clicked shut. The teasing smirk was still there, but it had dulled, faded into something that no longer quite reached his eyes. She tapped her fingers against the desk, tilting her head slightly. So, she said smoothly, what is it that you really came here for? Lucavion exhaled through his nose, leaning forward slightly. He rested his elbow against the desk, his fingers lightly grazing his chin. For a moment, he didn't answer, as if considering how much he wanted to say. Then, finally, he spoke. I want you to find someone. Corvina blinked. She had expected many things. More trade discussions, an extension of negotiations, perhaps even another taunt meant to test her patience. But this was different. Her expression didn't waver, but inwardly, her mind was already turning. Find someone? She repeated. Lucavion nodded. Yes. And then, the temperature in the room shifted. It wasn't something tangible, not something the average person would notice. But Corvina wasn't average. She felt it immediately, the pressure, the weight in the air. It was subtle, a quiet, controlled release of his aura. Just enough to be felt, just enough to warn. Lucavion's smirk faded entirely. And then, his dark eyes met hers. I want you to find someone who participated in the War of Valerius Plains. Chapter 524. Find someone for me, too. I want you to find someone who participated in the War of Valerius Plains. Corvina's fingers stilled against the desk. The Valerius Plains? That war had been just a year ago. A bloody, brutal conflict that had reshaped entire border between Arcani's empire and Loria Empire. A war that had taken countless lives. A war that should have left nothing behind but bones buried beneath the grass. Corvina's fingers tapped lightly against the desk as her mind swiftly processed Lucavion's request. The Valerius Plains War. It had raged for nearly 4 years, a brutal conflict that had redrawn the borders between the Arcanes Empire and the Loria Empire. A war of attrition, of shifting strategies, of thousands upon thousands of lives lost in the name of conquest. And yet, despite the long and bitter struggle, Arcanes had emerged victorious. Because of that victory, the war was still fresh. The records hadn't yet faded into obscurity. The survivors had not fully scattered, and the names of its warriors, both celebrated and forgotten, were still written in the annals of history. Finding a single knight among them wouldn't be easy, but it was possible. If she worked at it, if she pulled the right strings and contacted the right people, she could find out who Lucavion was looking for. Still, she needed more. She exhaled slowly, leveling him with a steady gaze. The war lasted nearly 6 years, Lucavion. That's a long time for a battlefield that spanned an entire border. Lucavion said nothing, simply waiting. If you want me to track down a single knight among thousands of soldiers, I need more details, Corvina continued, her voice crisp and professional. Rank, allegiances, specific battles they participated in. Lucavion leaned forward slightly, his fingers interlocking as he rested his elbows on the table. A knight, wind type awakened, a spear user, Arcanes Empire. Corvina narrowed her eyes as she studied Lucavion carefully. His request was already difficult, but what frustrated her more than anything was how vague he was being. A knight, fine. A wind type awakened, that certainly helped. A spear user, a strong identifier, but still too broad. From the Arcanes Empire, which was obvious, given the war's outcome. But even with all of that, it wasn't enough. She leaned forward slightly, her fingers tapping against the wooden surface of the desk, her tone sharp and professional. You must realize that's still a lot of people, Lucavion. Her mind was already filtering through possibilities. The war had raged for 4 years. Thousands of awakened warriors had taken to the battlefield. Some celebrated, some buried in nameless graves. A wind-type spear user among them wasn't impossible to find, but it certainly wasn't going to be easy. If I search through the records, I'll find plenty of knights who fit your description, she continued, her voice measured. Awakened warriors with wind affinities aren't common, but they aren't unheard of either. Do you have anything else to narrow this down? A title? A division? A commander they served under? Lucavion didn't answer immediately. Instead, he simply stared at her, his dark eyes unreadable. And then, he leaned back in his chair slightly, exhaling as if the answer itself was an afterthought. He showed his face in the war 4 years ago. Corvina's fingers stilled. Lucavion's voice was calm, steady, too steady. And never again. Silence. Corvina frowned, her mind quickly analyzing what that meant. 4 years ago, Corvina's fingers drummed against the desk, her mind turning over Lucavion's words like puzzle pieces in need of alignment. A knight who appeared only once and then vanished. The war lasted 6 years, she thought. If he showed up in the 3rd year and never again. That is both strange and not strange at the same time. It wasn't unheard of. There were many warriors who fought in one major battle and then disappeared, some due to death, some because they were wounded beyond recovery, and others because they were assigned to different posts or retired from the battlefield entirely. But something about the way Lucavion spoke made her uneasy. This knight wasn't just someone who disappeared. This was someone Lucavion was determined to find. And that made all the difference. Corvina exhaled slowly, leveling him with a steady look. How do you know about this? Lucavion didn't hesitate. It's not important. Corvina's brow twitched, annoyance flickering in her expression. It is important if you expect me to dig through war records, question high-ranking officials, and search for a man who, by all accounts, should have faded into history. Lucavion's smirk didn't fade, but his eyes didn't hold even a sliver of amusement. I don't care how you do it, Corvina, he said, his voice smooth, unwavering. Just find him. The weight in the room thickened. Corvina sighed, rubbing her temple lightly. The pressure he was leaking, it was subtle, controlled, but she felt it. This wasn't just a casual request. This wasn't even just business. This is personal. And that made it dangerous. She had known Lucavion for long enough to recognize that there were things he didn't say. Things buried beneath his easy smirks and sharp words. Hidden behind a persona so carefully constructed that few ever looked past it. But right now, he wasn't hiding the weight of this request. Which meant, I don't want to be this man's enemy. The thought settled in her chest like stone. Lucavion was dangerous in the way a storm was dangerous. Not because he actively sought destruction, but because when he moved, the world had no choice but to react. She didn't want to be on the wrong side of that. Not today. Not ever. Corvina let out a long breath before finally nodding. Fine. I'll do it. Lucavion leaned back, satisfied. Corvina exhaled slowly, her fingers pressing lightly against her temple. Fine. I'll do it. The words had barely left her lips, and already she felt the weight of them. This wasn't just another transaction. This wasn't a simple exchange of gold and goods. Lucavion's request came with something heavier, something unspoken that lingered between them like a phantom. And she wasn't blind to it. She had spent years in this position, dealing with all sorts of adventurers, nobles, mercenaries, and thieves. She knew when someone was keeping secrets. And Lucavion was made of them. She leaned back slightly, inhaling a quiet breath as she regarded him carefully. While I'm at it, I may as well do some digging of my own. She wouldn't say it aloud, but the thought had already rooted itself in her mind. Because something isn't right about you, Lucavion. His own past was just as much of a mystery as the night he was looking for. When she had traced his records, his origins, his so-called history, something about it hadn't added up. The gaps were too neat, the trails too well covered. As if someone had wiped away the details and left only enough for a name, a reputation, a legend. Sword Demon Lucavion. A title given to a man that, by all accounts, had appeared out of nowhere. And now, here he was, asking her to find a knight from a war that, by all logic, should not have mattered to him. But it did matter. And that was what made this dangerous. Corvina exhaled, letting her fingers slowly uncurl against the desk. If I start looking into his past. Her gaze flickered toward Lucavion, who watched her with his ever-present smirk, though his eyes gleamed with something deeper, something she could not read. I might not like what I find. That thought alone should have made her reconsider. But it didn't. It only made her more determined. Chapter 525. Date? The door creaked open, and Lucavion stepped out, adjusting the cuff of his glove with slow, deliberate ease. His expression was, as expected, entirely unbothered. His usual smirk already in place, his eyes gleaming with barely concealed amusement. At least that was how it looked to anyone else. He looked the same as always, entirely unbothered, his usual smirk resting easily on his lips, his eyes gleaming with that familiar amusement. But Aeliana had started figuring him out. She had seen it before, and she could see it now. He was masking it. Again. Lucavion loved to act as if nothing touched him, as if everything was some grand game he could play at his leisure. He would smirk, tease, and sidestep anything remotely uncomfortable with ease. But Aeliana had been watching. She had seen the way his expression had shifted when Corvina questioned him earlier, when she asked why he hadn't saved the others. He had laughed, sure. Had played it off, sure. But the weight behind his words, the way his voice had gone quiet, too calm. It hadn't been as effortless as he pretended. And now, as he walked out of that room, looking as smug as ever, she could see it again. Lucavion wasn't in the best condition right now. Oh, it wasn't physical. There were no signs of injury, no sluggishness in his movements. But something was weighing on him, just beneath the surface. It wasn't obvious. Not unless you were looking. But Aeliana was looking. And the more time she spent around him, the more she realized. This man never let himself sit with his own thoughts for too long. If something was bothering him, he would smirk through it. Play the fool. Shift the focus onto someone else, turning it into a joke or a passing remark. Aeliana wondered briefly how long he had been doing that. And why? Lucavion exhaled dramatically, placing a hand over his chest as if he were gravely wounded. You know, Eliana, I hate making a lady wait, but unfortunately, I didn't have a choice. He tilted his head, his smirk deepening. I'm really sorry for that. Again. He is doing it. Eliana watched him carefully. He was acting as if nothing was wrong, just like always. But now that she had started seeing through him, she wanted to confirm it. She wanted to see it more clearly. Lucavion was good at lying. Good at twisting words, at weaving half-truths into something that sounded real. But she had already figured out one thing. He never outright lied. Not when it came to things that mattered. So she decided to test him. Why? She asked, tilting her head slightly. If you're that sorry, why did you make me wait? Lucavion blinked, and for just a fraction of a second, she saw it, the faintest flicker of discomfort. A crack in his mask, brief and fleeting, before he smoothed it over with an easy chuckle. Ahaha. Well, he drawled, rubbing the back of his neck with exaggerated ease. That was kind of important. Eliana caught the way his smirk didn't quite reach his eyes this time. The way his body remained too measured, too casual. He doesn't want to talk about it. And she understood. She had been in that position before. The weight of something pressing down, the reluctance to speak of it, the desperate need to move past it before it could linger too long. And Lucavion never let things linger. So fine. If that was how he handled things, then she would simply do the same. Eliana let out an exaggerated sigh, placing a hand against her hip as she gave him a slow, appraising look. Kind of important, you say? She repeated, feigning disappointment. And here I thought you had some real regret. Lucavion's smirk twitched slightly. Oh? You doubt my sincerity? Eliana let out a dramatic hum, tapping her chin in mock thought. Well, you did make me wait, and now you're refusing to tell me why. I'd say that's enough of a crime to warrant compensation. Lucavion chuckled, the weight in his eyes shifting just slightly, lightening, even if only a little. Compensation, Eliana nodded solemnly. A proper apology. Lucavion sighed, shaking his head as if deeply troubled. Ha! You drive a hard bargain, little ember. Eliana smirked. I know. Lucavion exhaled dramatically, placing a hand over his chest once again. Very well. What would you have me do? Eliana pretended to consider it. Eliana tapped her chin thoughtfully, letting the moment stretch just long enough to keep Lucavion waiting. Then, with a small, deliberate sigh, she said, It's been a while since I've been out here, in the streets of Stormhaven. Lucavion's smirk widened immediately, the glint of mischief returning to his eyes. Ah! He murmured, tilting his head slightly. How rude of me. Before Eliana could react, he moved. With the dramatic flourish of a man who lived for theatrics, Lucavion placed one knee on the cobblestone street, resting a hand over his chest as he lowered his head slightly in mock reverence. Eliana barely held back a scoff. Oh, so he's doing this now. Lucavion lifted his gaze to hers, his expression a perfect picture of poetic devotion. Lady Eliana, he intoned, his voice rich with exaggerated elegance. Would you grant me the honor of accompanying you on this beautiful day? The way he said beautiful, slow, deliberate, entirely over the top, made it very clear he was enjoying himself far too much. Several passers-by glanced their way, their expressions a mix of amusement and confusion. A few of them even whispered among themselves. Eliana inhaled deeply, composing herself before she tilted her head slightly. You're certainly putting in the effort, she mused, crossing her arms. But I don't know. Is that all you can offer? Lucavion gasped dramatically. My, you wound me. Eliana smirked. Then I suppose you should try harder. Lucavion chuckled, his amusement evident. But instead of standing, he remained on one knee, reaching for her hand. Eliana narrowed her eyes slightly, but she didn't pull away. Lucavion's fingers brushed against hers lightly, his touch warm and measured, and then, he lifted her hand just slightly, bowing his head over it, stopping just shy of pressing his lips against her knuckles. Eliana felt the faintest prickle of awareness at the deliberate pause. Lucavion smirked against her skin, though he didn't close the distance. Then, in a voice softer, smoother, undeniably teasing, he murmured, "Is this enough effort for you, little Ember?" Eliana exhaled through her nose. She hated how good he was at this. Still, she had already committed to playing along. So, with the ease of someone completely unfazed, she tilted her chin slightly and said, I suppose it will do." Lucavion chuckled, finally rising to his feet, his smirk never wavering. "Then let's go," he said smoothly. "Stormhaven awaits." And just like that, they walked forward, Lucavion at her side, ever the insufferable menace, and Eliana, who absolutely refused to acknowledge the way her hand still faintly tingled. Chapter 526. A date? 2. The streets of Stormhaven stretched before them, bathed in the golden hues of the late afternoon sun. The city's familiar rhythm pulsed around Eliana, the steady hum of merchants calling out their wares, the rhythmic clatter of carriage wheels against cobblestone, the occasional laughter of children weaving through the crowd. And yet, this felt different. It had been a long time since she had walked like this, freely, without carriages, without attendants trailing behind her, without the ever-present presence of the duchy's guards shadowing her every step. Even before her illness, she had never truly walked the streets of Stormhaven alone. There had always been someone, a reminder of the status she carried, of the life she was bound to. But now she was here, moving at her own pace, with no one dictating her steps, no expectations, no watchful eyes monitoring her every movement, just the steady rhythm of her boots against the stone, the cool evening breeze curling through the streets, and Lucavion. She glanced at him out of the corner of her eye. He walked beside her, hands in his pockets. His usual smirk softened into something almost lazy, almost natural. There was no teasing remark waiting on his lips, no immediate attempt to turn the silence into something playful. He was just walking. It was strangely calming. Stormhaven itself had not changed much. The shops were the same, their signs worn from time but still standing. The people bustled about with the same energy, the same familiarity. Eliana let her eyes wander, taking it all in. And yet, even though the city remained largely unchanged, she wasn't the same girl who had once watched these streets from the window of a carriage, who had only ever glimpsed them from a distance. The quiet rhythm of their walk stretched between them, neither rushing nor hesitating. The moment felt strangely undisturbed. But, of course, Lucavion never let anything stay undisturbed for long. "Can you feel it?" he asked, his voice light, casual, yet carrying that distinct undertone that suggested he already knew the answer. Eliana blinked, glancing at him. "Feel what?" Lucavion tilted his head slightly, smirking. "The gazes." Eliana frowned, and then, almost instinctively, she lifted her head. The moment she did, she noticed it. People were looking at her. No staring. Not everyone, but enough. Some were subtle, stealing glances as they passed, whispering to each other. Others weren't nearly as discreet, their gazes lingering too long, their expressions shifting between curiosity, wariness, and something else she couldn't quite place. "What?" she muttered, her brows furrowing. Lucavion exhaled a quiet chuckle. "Well," he mused, "right now, you're not exactly dressed like someone people see walking through these streets every day." Eliana opened her mouth to protest, then stopped, and then realization. Her dress. She had overlooked it entirely. When she had prepared herself this morning, it had been for a formal meeting, to stand before her father, to reflect the image of House Thaddeus. And now she was walking through Stormhaven streets in the same attire. The expensive fabrics, the delicate embroidery, the unmistakable quality of noble craftsmanship. She wasn't wearing the kind of dress one casually wore in the city. She was wearing something meant for grand halls, for meetings with aristocrats, for representing the duchy itself. Eliana slowly exhaled. And then she understood why the adventurers at the guild had seemed so wary when she stood waiting outside. Why people here were watching her, whispering among themselves. Lucavion was, of course, enjoying this far too much. His smirk deepened, and with a light, knowing tone he said, "If you're fine with it, I don't mind. I just wanted to make sure you wouldn't find this out at a crucial time." Eliana wanted to curse him, because the worst part? He was right. If he hadn't said anything, she would have still noticed. Just a little later, and then it would have been the same, only worse, realizing it at the wrong moment, in the middle of some unavoidable situation, when the whispers would have already grown too loud to ignore. She clenched her jaw, inhaling slowly through her nose. Lucavion, meanwhile, looked utterly pleased with himself. And then, "My lady!" His voice took on a dramatically exaggerated politeness as he turned to her, dark eyes gleaming with mischief. "How about this gentleman here buys you some clothes?" Eliana turned to him slowly, and just stared. Lucavion grinned. "What? You don't like the offer?" Eliana exhaled through her nose. "I have plenty of clothes." Yes, noble clothes." Lucavion gestured at her attire with an amused flick of his wrist. "Not exactly fit for blending in, wouldn't you say?" Eliana narrowed her eyes. Lucavion raised a brow, looking entirely unbothered. For a brief moment, Eliana considered rejecting him outright. But then, she glanced down at her dress again, at the pristine embroidery, at the rich fabric, at how completely out of place it was here. She hated that he had a point. She crossed her arms. "Fine." Lucavion's smirk widened. "Oh? Just like that?" Eliana shot him a look. "Before I change my mind." Lucavion chuckled, then extended a hand toward her, palm up. "Then, my lady, shall we?" Eliana rolled her eyes, ignoring the offered hand as she walked ahead. Lucavion let out a dramatic sigh, shaking his head as he followed after her. "Isn't it a bit rude for a lady to ignore a gentleman's hand like that?" He placed a hand over his chest, his voice dripping with mock pain. "I am really hurt." Eliana didn't even glance back. "If you're hurt from this much, guess how much I was hurt when you said those things to me." Lucavion immediately cleared his throat. "Ahem. Will you bring this up every time?" "Yes." "Never forget?" "I will not." At that, Eliana turned on her heel to face him, her expression composed, except for the unmistakable mischief gleaming in her amber eyes. "And you will never be forgiven," she declared, her voice smooth, her lips curving into something sharp and playful. Lucavion blinked, tilting his head as if considering. Then, "So," Eliana continued, the amusement in her tone unmistakable, "you'd better spend the rest of your life making it up to me." Lucavion exhaled through his nose, laughing softly. "Haha, how terrifying." Chapter 527. A Spender Lady. The city square was alive with the usual evening bustle. Merchants packing away goods, last-minute shoppers haggling over prices, the scent of baked bread and roasted meats lingering in the air. The sun was dipping lower now, casting long shadows over the stone pathways, and with it, the warmth of the day had begun to fade. A crisp breeze curled through the streets, carrying with it the first signs of the evening chill. And yet, Lucavion was not concerned with the cold. No, his current concern was something far more dangerous. His wallet, because Eliana, calm, composed, vengeful Eliana, had decided that if he was offering to buy her clothes, then she would take full advantage of it. And she did so with the smooth efficiency of a woman who had no intention of holding back. Lucavion exhaled, standing with his hands in his pockets as yet another set of clothes was added to the growing pile. How did it get to this point? Yes, it started when they approached a well-known clothing vendor near the center of the square. The shop was set up beneath a large canvas awning, racks of clothing neatly arranged under the warm glow of lanterns. The merchant, a shrewd-looking woman with quick hands and even quicker words, had immediately taken an interest in Eliana, recognizing the signs of nobility despite her current attempt to blend in. That, of course, led to this. Eliana, standing before a full-length mirror that had been set up outside the stall, inspected herself with quiet precision as she tried on the first selection. A fitted dark green tunic with delicate gold embroidery along the sleeves, paired with a high-collared, fur-lined cloak that draped elegantly over her shoulders. Functional and warm, she mused, turning slightly to examine the fabric. I like this one. Lucavion smirked. Well, that was fast. Eliana arched a brow. Oh, we're far from done. And she meant it, because next came a deep navy blue overcoat, sleek and fitted, cinched at the waist with subtle silver detailing along the cuffs. Beneath it, a midnight black blouse, layered with a high-necked tunic that flattered her frame without being overly restrictive. Lucavion whistled. Ah, you do look sharp in that one. Eliana smirked. Noted. Then came a softer look. A pale cream blouse, light and airy, paired with a deep burgundy vest that added a touch of richness to the ensemble. Eliana adjusted the cuffs slightly, as if testing the feel of it, before giving a small nod of approval. Lucavion hummed. I suppose I should have expected you to be thorough. Oh, we haven't even started, Eliana replied smoothly, and she proved it. A charcoal gray traveling coat, long and practical, lined with subtle silver threading. A light brown tunic, layered with a sleeveless black surcoat that gave it a slightly more structured look. A dark crimson shirt, made of finer material, paired with a subtle leather belt. By the time Eliana had finished selecting several sets of outfits, including boots and gloves, Lucavion was standing beside a growing stack of wrapped parcels. He exhaled, shaking his head as he handed over yet another payment to the merchant, who was far too happy to accommodate this turn of events. You know, he mused, glancing at Eliana, I'm starting to think you're enjoying this a little too much. Eliana, dressed now in one of her new selections, a fitted black tunic with a structured deep green cloak, tilted her head slightly. I am, she admitted without hesitation. Lucavion exhaled a soft laugh, shaking his head. At least you're honest. Eliana adjusted the cloak slightly, fastening it at her collarbone. If you complain, I could always find more. Lucavion held up a hand. No, I know when I've lost. Eliana smirked. Good. Eliana stepped back into the small fitting area, pulling the curtain closed behind her as she began to change. The creamy blouse was light against her skin, the fabric softer than she expected. She had bought it more out of curiosity than anything else. Something different, something simple. She fastened the buttons, adjusting the cuffs before reaching for the burgundy vest she had also chosen. It fit well, snug against her frame, adding a structured touch to the otherwise relaxed look. But after a moment, she hesitated. It was warm. The evening air had cooled, but the layers felt too much. Eliana exhaled softly, undoing the vest and setting it aside. Stepping out, she found Lucavion already waiting. He had, of course, stored everything neatly away in his spatial ring, effortlessly removing the weight of the purchases with a flick of mana. It was unfairly convenient, something she would never admit aloud. Lucavion glanced at her as she approached, his eyes briefly flickering over her new outfit before settling back on her face. Eliana smoothed the cuffs of her blouse as they started walking. It's the first time I've worn commoner's clothes. Lucavion raised a brow. Truly. Eliana nodded, looking down at herself for a moment. I always thought it would feel different. Lucavion hummed in thought before offering smoothly. The quality may not be top-notch, but clothing is clothing at the end of the day. He smirked slightly. It is the wearer that makes it shine. Eliana arched a brow, tilting her head slightly. Oh, is that a compliment? Lucavion chuckled. Indeed. Then, with the casual ease of someone who enjoyed stirring trouble, he nodded slightly toward the square. Look, even now, quite a few people are still looking at you. See that guy over there? Eliana followed his gaze, and sure enough, there was a young man near one of the food stalls, pausing mid-bite into a roasted skewer. His gaze locked on her with unmistakable admiration. Eliana blinked. Lucavion grinned. He cannot take his eyes off you. Eliana let out a soft, unimpressed sigh. Of course he can't. It wasn't arrogance, it was fact. She had been raised in a world where beauty was another form of currency, where appearances mattered as much as reputation. She knew what she looked like. She had always known. So the attention didn't surprise her. But what did surprise her was that she didn't care. Not about him. Not about them. Her thoughts drifted, almost unconsciously, to the man beside her. Eliana's gaze lingered on Lucavion, her expression unreadable. Then, with smooth precision, she asked, "What about you?" Lucavion turned to her, arching a brow. Eliana tilted her head ever so slightly, her amber eyes gleaming. "Can you take your eyes off me?" Lucavion's smirk didn't falter. If anything, it deepened, like he had been waiting for something amusing to happen. But then, he looked at her, really looked at her, and Eliana refused to look away. She held his gaze, steady and unwavering, letting the silence stretch between them like a taut wire. Lucavion didn't move, didn't speak. His dark eyes searched hers, as if trying to find the angle to turn this into yet another playful exchange. Yet something in her expression made him pause. And then, he broke first. Lucavion averted his gaze, turning his head just slightly, exhaling through his nose as if utterly unbothered. "See," he murmured, his voice perfectly even. "I can." But Eliana saw it. The way his fingers flexed ever so slightly in his pockets. The way his smirk, though still present, had lost a fraction of its usual sharpness. And, most importantly, the way the tips of his ears had turned just the faintest shade of red. Eliana let the moment stretch just a bit longer, committing the sight to memory. Then, she smirked. Lucavion cleared his throat. "Let's go." Chapter 528. Pay attention. "Let's go." Eliana arched a brow, her smirk still lingering. "To where?" Lucavion exhaled, rolling his shoulders with exaggerated laziness. "I don't know." Eliana let out a quiet chuckle. "Hey!" And that was when she knew she had won. But as she watched him, something else caught her attention. Lucavion had always dressed simply. She had noticed it before, but now, after all the time they had spent in the clothing vendor, it became even clearer. His current outfit was well made, but it was plain, functional, easy to move in, but lacking any thought for style. It made sense. He was an adventurer, always on the move, and practicality would naturally come first. But at the same time, would it really be so bad if he put in just a little effort? Eliana's gaze flickered across the market, and then, she saw it. A vendor a short distance away, displaying finely tailored coats and structured tunics, a stark contrast to the rugged, travel-worn attire Lucavion usually wore. Perfect. Without another word, Eliana turned on her heel. Lucavion blinked, watching her sudden shift in direction. "And where are you going?" Eliana glanced over her shoulder, her expression unreadable. "Fixing something." Lucavion narrowed his eyes slightly. "Should I be concerned?" Eliana didn't answer. Instead, she reached out, grabbed his wrist, and dragged him toward the stall. Lucavion barely had time to react before he found himself standing in front of a row of finely crafted shirts and coats, the merchant already perking up at the sight of them. "A pleasure to serve you both. What are you looking for?" Eliana released his wrist, crossing her arms as she inspected the selection with sharp eyes. "Him?" she said simply, nodding toward Lucavion. Lucavion blinked. "Me? Yes. You." He tilted his head slightly, his smirk creeping back. "I wasn't aware my fashion sense was offensive." Eliana shot him a pointed look. "It isn't offensive. It's just lacking." Lucavion gasped dramatically. "You wound me, little ember." Eliana ignored him, already sifting through the fabrics. "Your outfit this morning wasn't bad, but it didn't suit you." Lucavion sighed, shaking his head. "And you care about this because?" Eliana hummed. "Because I feel like it." Lucavion narrowed his eyes playfully. "That's not an answer." Eliana smirked. "Yes, it is." And with that, she began pulling clothes for him to try. A structured black coat, sleek and tailored, lined with deep emerald fabric on the inside, rich without being overbearing. A well-fitted dark gray shirt, subtly embroidered at the cuffs, paired with a matching waistcoat. A navy overcoat with silver buttons, striking but understated. Lucavion, despite his initial reluctance, found himself caught in the momentum of it. And then, somehow, he was enjoying himself. Eliana watched as his amusement shifted into something genuine. The way he appraised the fit of the coats with a glint of interest. The way he tested the movement in the shirts, smirking slightly as he ran a hand down the lapels. She had seen him in many moods. Teasing, arrogant, reckless. But this was just fun. And for some reason, that made her smile. By the time they finished, Eliana stood with her arms crossed, surveying Lucavion with an unmistakable sense of satisfaction. Finally, he looked presentable. The black coat she had picked for him fit perfectly, structured just enough to sharpen his already striking presence without making him look stiff. The deep emerald lining gave a subtle richness to the otherwise dark ensemble, while the crisp gray shirt underneath added just enough contrast to keep it from looking too severe. Paired with the fitted waistcoat and sleek leather gloves, he looked, well, not bad. Eliana gave a slow, approving nod. Humph. Finally in some good clothing. Lucavion let out a long sigh, rubbing the back of his neck. Appeasing you, he muttered, is harder than some of the battles I've fought. Eliana smirked. Are you saying I'm difficult? Lucavion met her gaze, deadpan. Yes, Eliana hummed, tapping her chin in mock thought. But isn't it worth it? Lucavion sighed dramatically, shaking his head. Debatable. Eliana chuckled, looking him over once more. At least now you don't look like a reckless wanderer. Lucavion raised a brow. And what if I have good fashion sense? Eliana blinked. Then, she laughed. Lucavion narrowed his eyes. Why are you laughing? Eliana lifted a hand to her mouth, trying to suppress her amusement. Oh no reason. It's just. She exhaled, composing herself. That was funny. Lucavion clicked his tongue, shaking his head. I don't like that reaction. Eliana smirked. You should get used to it. Lucavion watched her for a moment before letting out a chuckle of his own. Low and warm, the kind that slipped out before he could stop it. Eliana caught it. And, strangely enough, she liked it. Lucavion stretched slightly, rolling his shoulders as if adjusting to the new outfit. So, he mused, are we finally done, little Ember? Eliana smirked. For now. Lucavion exhaled, shaking his head. A dangerous woman you are. Eliana hummed. And you just realized that now? Lucavion laughed again. Really laughed this time. Following that, he let out a slow breath, shaking his head with an amused smirk. I should have realized it sooner. Eliana gave him an approving nod. That's right. He chuckled again, slipping his hands into his pockets as they stepped out of the vendor's stall and back into the streets of Stormhaven. The evening air had grown even cooler now, the remnants of the sun casting a golden glow along the rooftops, fading into the encroaching dusk. The city had begun its transition into night, lanterns flickering to life, shopkeepers closing up, while others prepared for the liveliness that only emerged after sundown. And so they walked. Neither of them rushed. Neither of them spoke immediately. Then, this city, Eliana began, her voice smooth, measured, was founded by my great-great-great-grandfather. Lucavion glanced at her, his smirk easing into something quieter. Oh, Eliana nodded, her gaze drifting across the streets as if seeing something beyond the present. Back then, this land was little more than rough terrain. Mountains to the north, rivers carving through the landscape, scattered settlements barely surviving. She gestured slightly as they walked, as if mapping out the past with her words. He saw potential here. He built Stormhaven from the ground up, securing trade routes, forming alliances. The walls surrounding the city, his design. Lucavion listened, silent but attentive. Eliana continued. What was once unstable became a hub of commerce, a city protected against the storms that ravaged the coastline, hence, Stormhaven. She exhaled softly. Generations passed, The city flourished, and my family remained at its center. The Duchy of Thaddeus. Eliana's steps slowed. Her amber eyes flickered toward something. A small display at the edge of a vendor's stall. Lucavion caught the shift immediately. Eliana? She didn't answer at first, her gaze lingering for just a second too long before she looked away. Lucavion followed her line of sight and saw it. But before he could comment, Eliana had already turned her head, resuming their walk as if nothing had caught her attention at all. Sometimes, she said smoothly, voice slipping back into its usual controlled rhythm, I just wonder. Lucavion tilted his head slightly, watching her carefully. Wonder what? Eliana exhaled softly, the flickering lantern lights casting shifting shadows across her face. If things had been different, she murmured. Would I have ever walked these streets like this? Without guards, without expectations. Without feeling as if every step I take is being measured against something greater. Lucavion didn't respond right away. Instead, he let the weight of her words settle. The Eliana that people whispered about, the noble daughter of House Thaddeus, the heir to Stormhaven, the once fragile girl confined behind grand estate walls, would never have been here, dressed like this, speaking like this. And yet, here she was. Lucavion smirked slightly, his voice low, casual. Maybe not. Eliana glanced at him. He continued, but if things had been different, then you wouldn't be you. Eliana arched a brow, intrigued despite herself. And who exactly am I then? Lucavion exhaled in amusement. A dangerous woman who takes far too much joy in emptying my wallet. Eliana let out a soft scoff, shaking her head. And yet you let it happen. Lucavion chuckled. What can I say? I enjoy watching your smile. Eliana blinked. Something in his tone, light, teasing, yet carrying an almost too easy honesty, made her pause. But Lucavion had already turned his gaze back to the street ahead, his smirk still in place, as if the words meant nothing at all. Rumble, until a sound came. Ah! From someone's stomach. Chapter 529, Hungry. Rumble. Silence. Eliana and Lucavion both turned to each other at the same time, their expressions unreadable, cold, perfectly composed. For a long moment, neither said a word. Then, Lucavion smirked. If you're hungry, you could have just said so. Eliana's eye twitched. The sound didn't come from my stomach. Lucavion let out a slow hum, crossing his arms. Oh? Then did it come from mine? No way. Eliana exhaled through her nose, unimpressed. If you're that desperate to blame someone, why not the cat? Lucavion chuckled, shaking his head. Vitaliera is far too dignified for such things. Eliana smirked slightly. Unlike you. Lucavion gasped dramatically, placing a hand over his chest. How cruel. Eliana scoffed, crossing her arms. If you're hungry, say it. Lucavion shrugged. I would if I were. Eliana gave him a flat look, unconvinced. Lucavion held her gaze entirely at ease. Then, rumble. A pause. A long, painfully obvious pause. Lucavion blinked. Eliana blinked. Slowly, deliberately, Eliana tilted her head. Interesting. Lucavion exhaled through his nose, straightening. That was nothing. Eliana hummed, clearly enjoying this. Was it? Yes. Rumble. Eliana arched a single brow, her smirk curling just slightly. Lucavion sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Fine. Eliana smirked. So, what was that about me being hungry? Lucavion waved a hand dismissively. Let's not dwell on the past. Eliana let out a quiet chuckle. So what now? Should we address the fact that the mighty Lucavion has been bested by hunger? Lucavion sighed dramatically. Ha! It seems my suffering will never end. Eliana chuckled. Correct. Lucavion glanced around before stretching slightly. Well then, I suppose we should find something to eat. Eliana smirked. Now that's an idea. Lucavion scanned the market, his smirk returning as his eyes landed on a small diner tucked just between two busy stalls. Lanterns hung along its wooden frame, casting a warm glow against the stone pavement. and the scent of freshly grilled meat and simmering spices lingered in the air. "There," he said, nodding toward it. "Since we're in the market, we might as well try some local food." Eliana followed his gaze, taking in the sight. It was nothing grand. Not a noble's feast, not a carefully curated meal served on fine porcelain. But it smelled rich, inviting, real. "That sounds good," she admitted. "It's been a while since I've eaten outside of my room." Lucavion grinned. "Then allow me." With an exaggerated flourish, he stepped ahead, offering his arm as if they were about to enter a grand banquet hall instead of a modest little eatery. "Shall we, my lady?" Eliana rolled her eyes but accepted, letting him escort her toward the diner. As they reached the entrance, she glanced up at him. "You do remember that you're the one who's hungry, don't you?" Lucavion gasped, utterly scandalized. "My lady, what do you mean?" Eliana arched a brow, unimpressed. Lucavion chuckled, lowering his voice into something far too smooth, far too practiced. "It is definitely for me, indeed." Eliana smirked. "For dining with such a beauty as yourself is the best reward." Eliana let out a quiet chuckle, shaking her head. For some reason, his ridiculous antics really did bring her mood up. As they stepped toward the warmly lit diner, the scent of roasted spices growing stronger, Lucavion's smirk had just settled comfortably on his face, when a low, unmistakable sound stopped him mid-step. "Grr." Eliana raised an eyebrow. "Oh!" Lucavion barely had time to turn before a blur of white fur leaped onto his shoulder with practiced ease. Vitaliera. Her tail flicked once, wrapping loosely around the back of his neck as her eyes, brilliant and sharp, locked onto Eliana. And then, grr. This time it was direct. A distinct, pointed little growl, meant just for her. Eliana blinked, momentarily caught off guard. Did she just? Lucavion, to his credit, sighed with all the weight of a man used to far too many absurdities. "Vitalia. 2 hours," Vitaliera said, her voice smooth, but there was an edge to it. "I was gone for 2 hours, and this is what I returned to." Lucavion exhaled, long and slow, his mind already shifting gears. "All right then, let's hear it." Vitaliara's tail flicked once, her golden eyes narrowing. She was still curled around his shoulder, her small yet imposing form pressing against him like a physical accusation. "You really can't be left alone for even a few hours, can you?" Lucavion smirked slightly, keeping his expression unreadable to the outside world. "You make it sound like a disaster happened." "It did," she replied flatly. "This happens every time. First, that night woman. Now, this arrogant girl." Lucavion nearly chuckled. "Ahaha, why do you think she's arrogant? Is she not?" Lucavion tilted his head, considering. "She may be a little..." And then, Eliana's sharp gaze flickered toward him, eyes narrowing. "You just thought something rude, didn't you?" Lucavion blinked, the timing almost supernatural. "What? Me?" "Perish the thought, little ember." Eliana hummed suspiciously. But she didn't press further. Instead, she turned, stepping inside the diner with easy grace. Lucavion exhaled, amusement curling at the edges of his smirk. "Saved by timing, as always. One day your luck will run out," Vitaliera muttered, though she made no move to leave his shoulder. Lucavion only chuckled under his breath. With smooth confidence, he stepped ahead of Eliana, weaving effortlessly through the dimly lit, warmly buzzing interior of the diner. The scent of seared meat, roasted spices, and freshly baked bread wrapped around them. The place was modest, wooden beams, candlelit chandeliers, simple yet well-kept furnishings, but it carried the kind of charm that only places filled with real people did. As they reached a table near the window, Lucavion moved before Eliana could sit, smoothly pulling out her chair with an easy flick of his wrist. "After you," he said, his voice laced with its usual teasing warmth. Eliana arched a brow before stepping forward, settling into the seat with a faint, skeptical hum. "Humph, at least you know basic etiquette." Lucavion leaned slightly against the back of the chair, smirking down at her. I do try to meet the bare minimum expectations of civilization. Eliana gave him a long, unimpressed look. Lucavion only grinned. And with that, the night continued. As soon as Eliana settled into her seat, Vitaliera moved as well, graceful, effortless. She leapt from Lucavion's shoulder to the windowsill, her small frame curling into a comfortable position where the last remnants of the setting sun painted her fur in hues of soft gold and white. The contrast was striking. Against the dim glow of the diner, her presence was almost ethereal. The way her bright fur caught the light, her piercing eyes surveying the world with quiet wisdom. She looked less like a mere familiar and more like a creature out of legend, something untouchable yet undeniably real. Eliana tilted her head slightly, watching the way the light played against Vitaliara's form. Your familiar looks really good, she mused. It suits you. Lucavion arched a brow at that. Oh, Eliana nodded, her gaze still on Vitaliera. How did you two meet? After all, finding a familiar isn't an easy task. Lucavion exhaled, leaning back slightly, his arms resting casually on the table. Ah, that's a long story. Eliana smirked. I'm all ears. Lucavion's gaze flickered toward her, his expression unreadable for a beat. Then, with an almost lazy smile, he replied, Maybe, but it's not the time for that. Eliana's amber eyes narrowed slightly at him, studying his expression, but she didn't push further. She could sense it, that subtle shift in the air, the way his tone carried something just beneath the surface, a weight he wasn't letting her see. Interesting. Still, before she could consider pressing further, she felt it. A gaze, sharp, unwavering. She turned, locking eyes with Vitaliera. The cat. No, the familiar was staring at her, and not in a casual way. It was deliberate, assessing, a gaze that carried something almost possessive. Eliana arched a brow. Oh, so that's how it is. But she didn't look away. If the cat wanted a battle of stares, then fine. She wasn't the type to back down. For a long moment, the two of them simply stared. Silent, unmoving, the tension unspoken but palpable. Then, Lucavion laughed. A rich, warm chuckle, unhurried and laced with amusement as he took in the scene before him. Well, this is fantastic, he mused, smirking. I don't even have to say anything. You two are already at war. Eliana scoffed, leaning back slightly but keeping her smirk. I don't know what you mean. Vitaliera, tail flicking once, exhaled softly. Neither do I. Chapter 530, Gourmet. Lucavion exhaled, rolling his shoulders as he cast a glance at the menu laid out before them. The small diner was a far cry from the luxurious in where he had once dined with Alara, but the scent of fresh spices and grilled meats was undeniably inviting. Still, there was a problem. He had no idea what half these dishes were. Eastern cuisine was a complex thing. Different regions had different traditions, different flavors, and while he had eaten fine meals before, he wasn't exactly well-versed in the intricacies of these particular dishes. Some were seafood-based, others rich in stews, and a few carried an aroma of unfamiliar spices that hinted at heat. His fingers tapped lazily against the table as he considered his options. And then he smirked. Eliana would enjoy this. With an air of exaggerated nonchalance, he leaned back in his chair, glancing at her. Well then, little Ember, he mused, his tone light, playful. Since you've already taken the liberty of dictating my wardrobe, why not extend your tyranny to my dinner as well? Eliana, who had been glancing at the menu, arched a brow at him. Oh, you're admitting defeat so easily. Lucavion smirked. Hardly. I'm merely granting you the privilege of choosing my meal. Eliana hummed, her amber eyes flickering with amusement. That's so? And here I thought you had refined tastes. I do, he replied smoothly, propping an elbow on the table. But I'm also a man of culture. I like to experience new things when someone competent is doing the choosing. Eliana let out a soft scoff, shaking her head. Flattery won't get you out of this, Lucavion. Ah, but was I trying to get out of it? His smirk widened. Perhaps I'm simply indulging in the rare pleasure of seeing you make a decision without overanalyzing it. Lucavion sighed, stretching his arms out with an easy, languid motion. Besides, he continued, tilting his head slightly, who better to judge than someone who has been at the mercy of a self-proclaimed gourmet? His smirk curled at the edges. One who dictates, critiques, and, if memory serves correctly, scoffs at every meal prepared in her presence. Eliana's fingers twitched slightly against the table. Her expression remained composed, unreadable, but for a moment, just a flicker, something in her gaze shifted. She remembered the time they spent together after being caught in the vortex. Stranded, half dead, forced to rely on each other in ways neither of them had ever anticipated. It had been messy, chaotic, but amidst the constant struggle for survival, there had been moments, small ones, where things had settled into something quieter. And back then, Eliana scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Oh, please." She leaned forward slightly, her smirk laced with sharp amusement. "I had standards, unlike you, who seemed perfectly content with consuming mediocrity." Lucavion raised a brow. "Mediocrity?" Eliana nodded, her tone dripping with faux sympathy. "If not for me, you would have lived in absolute, uninspired blandness." She tapped a finger against the table, her smirk growing. "You should be grateful someone like me was there to elevate your palate." Lucavion let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Ah, yes, how could I forget? A self-proclaimed gourmet, stranded in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but dried rations and desperation." Eliana crossed her arms. "And yet, even then, I refused to settle for something as dull as whatever you tried to pass off as food. 7 years ago. 7 years. It's been that long, hasn't it?" The thought was intrusive, unwelcome. She had changed from then, from the time she was a child gourmet. But even now, sitting across from him in a market diner, their words laced with teasing and challenge, some things still felt the same. Lucavion smirked, as if he had caught the exact moment she let her thoughts drift. "You never did explain where that refined taste of yours came from," he mused, resting his chin against his palm. "Were you always so impossible? Or was it something you cultivated out of sheer determination to make my life harder?" Eliana clicked her tongue. "Oh, wouldn't you like to know?" Lucavion exhaled, feigning exhaustion. "So mysterious, so dramatic." His smirk curled. "Just admit it. You enjoyed critiquing me. It gave you power." Eliana smirked right back. "And what if it did?" Lucavion leaned forward slightly, his smirk never fading. "Well, if you enjoyed it that much, then by all means." His voice was smooth, laced with something dangerously close to sincerity. "I don't mind." Eliana blinked. "What?" Lucavion tilted his head, studying her with lazy amusement. "If nitpicking my food choices makes you happy, then go ahead. Rarely did I see you look so." His gaze flickered over her expression, reading something unspoken. At ease. Eliana felt it instantly. The heat creeping up the back of her neck, the sudden, uncharacteristic prick of embarrassment. What is wrong with him? Saying something like that with no hesitation. She narrowed her eyes, searching for the tell, the usual playful deceit woven into his words. But nothing. No teasing glint. No mockery. Just a simple statement, spoken with ease, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. It had only been 2 days since they left that realm. 2 days since their time together had ended like that. And yet, the way he spoke, casual, effortless, as if those moments between them weren't just remnants of survival but something else. Eliana clicked her tongue, shaking off the ridiculous thought. Humph. She crossed her arms, forcing herself to exude nothing but practiced confidence. "I'm just making sure you don't embarrass yourself in public with your tragic taste." Lucavion chuckled, the sound rich and unhurried. "Ah, of course, the noble act of charity." Eliana exhaled sharply, ignoring the way her heart stupidly skipped a beat at his tone. Before she could retaliate, a shadow loomed over their table. The waiter had arrived. A slightly bulky man, built in the way so many Stormhaven locals were, broad shoulders, a weathered look, the kind of presence forged by years of labor rather than idleness. He held a small notepad in one hand, but his gaze lingered for a fraction of a second too long on Aliana. Not in the way most men looked at a noblewoman. It was more careful, hesitant, as if the weight of recognition had struck him before he forced himself to look away, quickly fixing his focus on Lucavion instead. Lucavion caught it instantly, of course. His smirk didn't fade, but there was something almost imperceptible in the way his posture shifted, casual yet subtly watchful. He leaned back slightly, letting the moment pass without remark. The waiter cleared his throat. Ready to order? Aliana didn't acknowledge the brief moment of recognition. She had spent years perfecting the art of ignoring such things. Instead, she nodded, smoothly listing off the choices she had made for them both. Aliana's voice was smooth, unbothered, as she listed the selections with an ease that suggested she had made up her mind long before the waiter even approached. We'll have the smoked river trout with saffron glaze, the spiced crab stew, and a side of rice wrapped in lotus leaves. Her tone was firm, decisive. And bring a serving of pickled greens to balance the flavors. The waiter nodded, scribbling the order down. Any drinks? Aliana tilted her head slightly. Warm citrus tea for me. Lucavion exhaled, smirking. And I'll take the same. The waiter gave a curt nod, his gaze flickering toward Aliana once more, brief, measured, before he turned on his heel and strode away. Lucavion watched him go, his fingers tapping lazily against the edge of the table. Then, with an exaggerated sigh, he leaned forward, resting his chin against his palm. You know, he mused, his smirk deepening, I'm starting to think you enjoy making decisions for me. Aliana scoffed. Someone has to. Lucavion chuckled. Fair enough. His gaze flickered with interest. So then, smoked river trout, crab stew, and lotus-wrapped rice? He arched a brow. I'll admit, I was expecting something heavier. This sounds, dare I say, refined. Aliana hummed. Of course it's refined. I wasn't about to let you order something tragic. Lucavion smirked, tilting his head. And tell me, little Ember, what exactly should I be expecting? Aliana's expression remained unreadable. Then, just the slightest curl of her lips. You'll see. Lucavion exhaled, shaking his head in mock surrender. Ah, the suspense. Aliana smirked. Consider it part of the experience. Lucavion leaned back, amusement flickering in his eyes. Fine, I'll play along. And just like that, the anticipation settled between them, quiet yet tangible, as they waited for their meal.
Hello everyone. We now have a Discord server. Join us for faster updates, discussions about your favorite novels, and exclusive Discord-only content. Don't miss out. See you there. Scan the QR code on the screen or enter any of the displayed links into your browser to join our Discord.